Buckingham Palace, the 24th of February 1981. A girl of 19 stands beside a man 12 years older, a new sapphire ring heavy on her finger, and the cameras are running. The engagement is official, and a reporter asks the question the whole nation wants answered. Are you in love? Diana answers at once. Of course, she says. The man beside her pauses. He has been trained since boyhood to weigh every word before it leaves him, to give away nothing that has not been measured first. So he does not say yes. He says 4 words, whatever in love means. In the room, the journalists barely register it, but those 4 words will follow him for the rest of his life. They will be replayed, dramatized, and held up again and again as proof of a colder truth. Here people will say, is the real Charles detached at the door of his own marriage, unable to give a simple answer to the simplest human question? That is the Charles the public has carried for more than 40 years. The remote one. The husband who could not love the most adored woman in the world. The prince who waited a lifetime for a throne that seemed as though it might never come. This film is about that man, but it will not invent a single private scene, and it will not pretend to read his mind. Everything you are about to hear comes from the public record, from his own words on camera, from the woman who loved him and the woman who left him, from court findings, palace statements, and the reporting of the day. The point is not to convict him, and it is not to defend him. The point is to measure the distance between the man the institution presents and the man the evidence reveals, and to ask what that distance is actually made of. Because the easy story needs Charles to be cold and nothing else. The record refuses to cooperate. The same guarded man would one day confess his own infidelity to the entire country on national television, an act of self-exposure almost no royal before him had ever risked. The same man dismissed as distant built more than 20 charities that pulled hundreds of thousands of hopeless young people into work, and the same man praised for that charity would later stand accused of accepting suitcases and shopping bags stuffed with cash from a foreign politician. He is not one thing. That is the problem with the cartoon. If you want the honest version, the one that goes past the headline and into the record, subscribe now, because there is a great deal more of this story to tell, and the channel runs on it. The boy who would become king once called his own schooling a prison sentence. He learned early to fold his feelings inward and show the world a calm surface. The world decided that calm meant he felt nothing. The evidence suggests almost the opposite. This was a man who felt a very great deal, and who spent his whole life trying to control it, and who was punished again and again on the rare occasions the control slipped and the truth got out. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Whatever in love means, he really did say it. By the end of this film, you may understand exactly what he meant. To understand the distance in him, you have to go back long before Diana, long before the cameras decided what he was. You have to go back to a small boy in a cold building in the north of Scotland, who would grow up to describe his own education, not as a privilege, but as a sentence to be served. Charles Philip Arthur George was born on the 14th of November 1948, inside Buckingham Palace, the first child of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His birth was announced to a crowd that had gathered outside the palace gates in the November dark, and they cheered for a baby who, the moment he drew breath, carried a future none of them, and none of his family, could change. He was not quite 4 years old when his grandfather, King George VI, died in his sleep in February 1952, and his mother became Queen Elizabeth II. In that instant, the small boy became heir apparent. The entire shape of his life was settled before he could read a word, before he could understand what a crown was, before he had any say at all. It is worth pausing on that, because it is the root of everything. Most children grow into some sense of who they might become. Charles was handed his destiny in the cradle and spent the next 7 decades waiting to fulfill it. There was no version of his life in which he got to choose. There was only the slow approach of a role he could neither refuse nor hurry. His mother, the new queen, was 25 years old and suddenly bound to a duty that would consume the rest of her life. Charles and his younger sister Anne were raised, in large part, by nannies and household staff, in the way of their class and their century. Elizabeth was not a cold mother by the standards of royal parenting, But she was a working sovereign with red boxes of state papers arriving every single day, and the demands of the throne came first because she believed with total sincerity that they had to. Affection in that household was real, but it was rationed, formal, and rarely spoken aloud. Charles grew up in palaces full of people and short on warmth, and he was, from the start, a sensitive child who noticed the difference. His father noticed it too, and disapproved. Prince Philip was a man of action, sport, and self-reliance, shaped by a chaotic and rootless childhood that he had survived through sheer toughness. He looked at his gentle, anxious elder son and decided the boy needed hardening. That decision, more than any other, would define Charles's youth. For centuries, the children of the British monarch had been educated privately inside the palace walls by tutors who came to them. Elizabeth and Philip chose to break that tradition. Charles would be the first heir to the British throne, sent out into the world to be schooled, alongside other children. On paper, it was a modern and generous idea, a prince learning to live among ordinary people. In practice, for a shy boy who could never be ordinary, it meant being placed, defenseless, exactly where he could be most easily watched, judged, and singled out. He began at Hill House, a day school in London, and then at 8 was sent to board at Cheam, a preparatory school in Berkshire that his father had also attended. Boarding at 8 is hard on any child. For Charles it was harder because there was no privacy and no escape from the fact of who he was. He could not make an ordinary friend because no friendship with the future king is ever quite ordinary, and the staff and the other boys all knew it. He was homesick, and he was lonely, and he learned the first hard lesson of his life. The feelings were his problem to manage, and the world had no intention of softening to accommodate them. Then came Gordonstoun and the worst years of his childhood. Gordonstoun sits on the cold north coast of Scotland, near the Moray Firth, exposed to the wind off the sea. It had been founded by the German educator Kurt Hahn on a philosophy that character was built through hardship, physical challenge, cold, discipline, and the deliberate stripping away of comfort. There were runs before breakfast, cold showers, open windows in winter, and a regime designed to toughen soft boys into resilient men. Prince Philip had thrived there. He sent his son in the firm belief that it would do the same for him. It did not. For Charles, Gordonstoun was close to a nightmare, and he said so, in letters home and in later accounts, in language that no palace press office would ever have invented for him. He found the cold brutal and the bullying relentless. The other boys, he later indicated, made his life miserable, and the very rules of the place worked against him. Anyone seen befriending the prince risked being mocked for sucking up, so the boys learned to keep their distance, and the few who might have been kind stayed away to protect themselves. He was, in the most literal sense, isolated by his own status, surrounded at all times yet genuinely alone. The school was nicknamed by people who knew its reputation, Colditz in kilts, after the wartime prison camp. Charles himself, reflecting on those years, summed up the experience in terms close to a prison sentence. He was glad to leave. Hold on to that image, because it is the key to the man the public would later misread so badly. A boy who is unhappy and watched at the same time learns very quickly that there is no profit in showing what he feels. Tears get reported. Weakness gets remembered. The safe move, the only move, is to fold the feeling inward, set the face still, and present a calm surface to a world that is always looking. The very quality strangers would one day call coldness was born here, in a cold school by a cold sea, as nothing more sinister than a frightened child's way of getting through the day. You do not weep at Gordonstoun. You endure, and you keep your face composed, and you do it for so long that eventually you forget you are doing it at all. There was one stretch of light in those years, and it came on the other side of the world. As a teenager, in 1966, Charles was sent for 2 terms to Australia, to Timbertop, the rural outpost of Geelong Grammar School in the bush of Victoria. It changed him. Far from the British press, far from the palace, far from the watching eyes that turned every move into a story, the pressure simply lifted. The Australian boys did not bow and did not fawn. They treated him with a rough, direct friendliness that took him at face value and teased him like anyone else. And for the first time in his life, he was something close to just another boy. He hiked, he chopped wood, he got his hands dirty, and by every account he was happier there than he had ever been in Britain. He spoke of Australia with warmth for the rest of his life. And the reason is not hard to find. It was the one place, in those formative years, where he got to find out who he was when nobody was treating him as a future king. Then it was back to Britain, and a quiet milestone that cuts hard against the Cold Prince story. In 1967, Charles went up to Trinity College, Cambridge. He read archaeology and anthropology at first, then moved to history, and when he finished he had done something no heir to the British crown ever managed. He had earned a real university degree. It is the sort of fact that gets skipped in the tabloid version of his life, and it should not be, because it tells you what kind of mind he had. This was a man who valued learning for its own sake, who read widely, who took ideas seriously, and who would spend the rest of his life thinking aloud in public about subjects that interested almost no one else of his rank: architecture, the natural world, philosophy, faith. He cared about these things deeply and genuinely, often years before they became respectable, and very often he was laughed at for it. In 1969, at the age of 20, the long apprenticeship turned into public theatre for the first time. He had been created Prince of Wales as a small boy back in 1958, but the title was now to be formally conferred in a grand ceremony at Caernarfon Castle in Wales. The timing was delicate and even dangerous. Welsh nationalism was rising, and to many in Wales, the idea of an English prince who could not speak a single word of their language was an insult, walking on two legs. There was real anger. In the lead-up to the ceremony there were protests, and there was even violence connected to extremist fringe groups opposed to the investiture. The palace understood the risk, and so Charles was sent ahead of the ceremony to spend a term at the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth, immersed in the Welsh language and Welsh history, to learn the tongue of the country whose prince he was about to become. He learned it, and on the 1st of July 1969, before a vast television audience, in front of a watching and divided nation, the 20-year-old knelt to receive the symbols of his office from his mother, then rose and delivered part of his address in Welsh, speaking about a proud people determined to guard their own particular heritage. The cynics had braced themselves for an awkward, tone-deaf Englishman going through the motions. What they got instead was a young man who had quietly done the hard work, taken the country's grievance seriously, and disarmed a hostile room by meeting it halfway. The reception against expectation was warm. It would become the pattern of his entire life. Underestimated, then quietly competent, then underestimated all over again. People kept deciding in advance that he would be a disappointment, and he kept, in his stubborn and unshowy way, proving them wrong, and then they kept forgetting and writing him off once more. After Cambridge came the uniform, following his father and his grandfather, and the long tradition of royal men in service. Charles entered the armed forces. He trained as a pilot with the Royal Air Force, qualifying as a flyer, and then served in the Royal Navy from 1971 to 1976. He flew helicopters off the decks of ships. He learned navigation, seamanship, and the discipline of command, and in his final months in the service, he was given the thing every naval officer works toward, his own ship to run, the coastal minesweeper HMS Bronington. For a few years he lived something close to an ordinary working life. He had a rank earned through training, duties that mattered, and men under him who depended on him to get things right in difficult conditions at sea. By many accounts it was a period he genuinely loved, and the reason tells you a lot about him. The Navy handed Charles the one thing his birth had stolen from him before he could even speak, a job that was actually his own. Aboard a ship, in foul weather, with a real task in front of him, he was judged on whether he did the work well, not on who his mother was, or what crown was waiting for him decades down the line. For a man who had spent his whole childhood being watched as a symbol, being treated as a competent officer must have felt like oxygen. And then it ended, and the real test of his character began. Not a test of courage at sea, but a test of patience on dry land, and it would last very nearly half a century. Because once the Navy was behind him, there was no next rung on the ladder. There was no promotion to wait for, no command to aim at, no obvious purpose at all. There was only the long, shapeless condition of being the heir. Picture the position honestly. A man in his late 20s, well-read, militarily trained, full of restless energy and strong opinions about the world, with no office to hold, no department to run, and no role assigned to him except to exist as the next in line and to avoid embarrassing the family. While he did it, His mother was young, healthy, and utterly devoted to her duty. The throne was not coming soon, and any decent son could hardly wish that it would, because to wish for the crown is to wish for the death of your own mother. In the end, the wait would stretch on for 46 years. Charles would become the longest-serving Prince of Wales and the longest-waiting heir in the entire 1,000-year history of the British monarchy. He would be 73 years old before the crown finally reached him. Most men handed that fate would have let it hollow them out. There were easy exits available to a wealthy prince with nothing official to do, a life of sport and estates and amiable uselessness, and nobody would have been very surprised if he had taken it. He did something stranger, and in its way far more admirable. He built himself a job out of nothing. In 1976, using his severance pay from the Navy as the seed money, he founded the Prince's Trust. Its purpose was the young people no one else was fighting for, the ones leaving care at 16 with nowhere to go, the ones coming out of prison with no way back in, the ones leaving school with no qualifications, no contacts, and no prospects of any kind. Over the decades that followed, the Trust would help hundreds of thousands of them, offering training, small grants to start businesses, mentoring, and a path into work for people the rest of society had quietly given up on. By any fair measure, it is an enormous achievement, the work of a lifetime, and for most of that time, it was nearly invisible to a public that preferred to picture him as a remote figure, talking to plants on a country estate. He did not stop at the Trust. He went on to establish more than 20 charities and initiatives over his years as Prince of Wales. He championed the environment and organic farming long before either was fashionable, when both were dismissed as the eccentric enthusiasms of a man with too much time and too few real problems. He fought to protect historic buildings and traditional crafts that were being bulldozed in the name of progress. He pressed for understanding between different faiths in an age that was growing more divided, and for almost all of it he was mocked. He was ridiculed across the country for admitting, in an unguarded interview, that he talked to his plants, a remark that became shorthand for a dotty, out-of-touch prince. He enraged the entire architectural establishment in 1984 when he attacked a proposed modern extension to the National Gallery in London, comparing it in one devastating phrase to a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend. The phrase stuck. The fury was immense. He was cast as a reactionary crank meddling in things he did not understand. And through it all, the laughter rolling over him, year after year, the work simply went on, in the long and otherwise empty interval of his waiting. This is the part of Charles that the cold cartoon cannot contain. A diligent, faintly lonely man, with no throne to occupy and no guarantee he ever would, quietly assembling a body of real work to give meaning to a life that the accident of birth had otherwise left without shape. You do not have to agree with everything he believed to see what it reveals about him. A genuinely cold and empty man does not spend 4 decades building things for people he will never meet and who can never thank him. Whatever else Charles was, and he was not indifferent. And yet, at the very same time as he was doing all of this good and patient work, he was failing completely at the single role the nation most wanted him to get right, the role of husband. Because while he was founding the Prince's Trust and waiting for a crown that would not come for decades, the fault line was already running silently underneath the rest of his life, and it had a name: Camilla. That is where the story turns. That is where the public would decide, for an entire generation, that they had been right about him all along, and the truth of it, drawn from the record rather than the rumor, is more tangled, more human, and in places more damning than either his defenders or his critics have ever wanted to admit. We will go there next. She was not a princess. She was not even, by the cautious standards of the palace, a particularly suitable match. When Charles first met Camilla Shand, in the early 1970s, she was a confident, witty young woman from the English upper class, comfortable in the world of horses and country weekends, blunt where he was guarded, funny where he was earnest. By every account that survives from those years, the young prince fell for her completely, and the feeling was returned. For the first time in a life spent performing for an audience, Charles had found someone who treated him as a person rather than of a position. It should have been simple. It was not, and the reasons it was not tell you almost everything about the world he lived inside. Charles, was the heir to the throne, and the heir to the throne, in the early 1970s, did not marry whoever made him happy. He married strategically, suitably, and ideally young. There were unwritten rules, old and rigid, about the kind of woman who could one day be queen. She was expected to have no romantic history that could ever surface, no past attachments, nothing that the press or the public could hold against the monarchy. Camilla, vivacious and worldly and already moving in fast society, did not fit that template, fairly or not, and while Charles wavered, as he tended to do when a decision required him to act rather than reflect, the Navy called him away to sea for long stretches, and life as it does, moved on without him. While he was away, Camilla married. Her husband was Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer she had known for years, a charming and well-connected army man. The marriage was real, and it produced children, and on the surface it closed the door on whatever Charles and Camilla had been to each other. Charles, the record suggests, was wounded by it, though he did what he always did with a wound, which was to fold it away and carry on. He had lost the woman who understood him, and he had lost her in part because he had not been able, or had not been allowed, to act decisively when it counted. That hesitation, that fatal slowness to commit, would echo through the rest of his story. For the rest of the 1970s, Charles was Britain's most eligible bachelor, and the press tracked his love life with growing impatience. He was linked to a string of young women, some seriously, some not. Among them, briefly, was Lady Sarah Spencer, the daughter of an old aristocratic family with deep ties to the crown. The relationship with Sarah did not last, but it brought Charles into the orbit of the Spencer family, and it was there, in the late 1970s, that he encountered Sarah's much younger sister, a shy teenager barely out of childhood named Diana. The age gap was significant. When their courtship began in earnest in 1980, Diana was 19 and Charles was 31. She was young, unworldly, and to the watching nation almost impossibly suitable. She came from the right kind of family. She had no romantic history that could embarrass anyone. She was gentle, pretty, and seemingly uncomplicated, and the press, which had been demanding that Charles settle down for the better part of a decade, fell instantly and completely in love with her. The pressure to propose was enormous, and it came from every direction at once. The country wanted a royal wedding. The family wanted the succession secured, and Charles, in his early 30s, with no role and a fading reputation as a man who could not commit, was running out of acceptable options and out of time. He proposed. Diana accepted, and on the 24th of February 1981, they stood together in the gardens of Buckingham Palace to announce it to the world. Which brings us back to those 4 words. When the reporter asked the newly engaged couple whether they were in love, Diana said, of course, instantly and warmly, the answer of a young woman who believed she was beginning a fairy tale. Charles, asked the same question, gave his now infamous reply, "Whatever in love means." It has been read ever since as the cold confession of a man marrying without feeling, and perhaps in part it was. But there is another reading the record allows, and it is sadder than the cynical one. Here was a man who had already loved and lost, and been taught by his whole upbringing to distrust the easy declaration. He may have been hedging, he may have been honest to a fault, refusing to perform an emotion he was not sure he could promise. Either way, the bride beside him did not yet know what those 4 words were hinting at, and the nation cheering the engagement did not know either. The fault line was already there, it simply had not surfaced. The wedding, when it came, was the largest single spectacle the modern monarchy had ever staged. On the 29th of July 1981, Charles married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. An estimated 750 million people around the world watched it. On television, one of the most viewed broadcasts in human history up to that point. Diana arrived in a gown with a 25-foot train, the embodiment of a storybook princess. The streets of London were packed. The country gave itself over to the romance of it completely. For one golden day, the public got exactly the fairy tale it had been promised, and Charles, standing at the altar in his naval uniform, played the part the nation needed him to play. But a wedding is a performance, and a marriage is a daily reality, and the gap between the two opened almost at once. Here it is important to be careful, because almost everything we know about the inside of that marriage comes from the 2 people who lived it, and they would each, in time, give the public radically different versions of what went wrong. We are not in a position to read minds or invent scenes behind closed doors. What we can do is set out what each of them said on the record when they finally chose to speak, and let the contradictions stand where they are. Diana's account, given first to the biographer Andrew Morton in the early 1990s and then directly to the Nation in 1995, was of a young woman who walked into the marriage hopelessly in love and quickly discovered she was not the only woman in it. By her telling, she came to believe early that Charles's affections still lay elsewhere, and that the marriage she had entered was, in her own unforgettable phrase, a bit crowded. She described a loneliness so total it consumed her. She spoke of the bulimia that took hold of her, of the postnatal depression after the births of her sons, and of a sense that the institution she had married into was cold, watchful, and incapable of helping her. She was a young woman in genuine distress, and the world she had entered was singularly ill-equipped to recognize distress, let alone treat it. Charles's account, given to the broadcaster Jonathan Dimbleby in 1994, was different in emphasis and in chronology. He maintained that he had been faithful to Diana until the marriage had, in his words, irretrievably broken down, with both of them having tried. By his telling, the rekindling of his relationship with Camilla came after the marriage was already beyond saving, not before. The two timelines do not agree. Diana believed the betrayal came early. Charles insisted it came late, only after the marriage was already dead in every way that mattered. Both cannot be entirely right, and from this distance, with both accounts on the record and one of the two people now gone, it is not possible to declare with certainty exactly when the line was crossed. What is certain is that the line was crossed, because Charles himself admitted it on television, and what is certain is that two people who should perhaps never have been married to each other made each other deeply unhappy. What made the private misery into a public catastrophe was the press, and the way both of them, in the end, chose to use it. For most of the 1980s the surface held. The royal couple toured the world, and everywhere they went the crowds came not for the heir to the throne, but for his young wife. Diana had become, with astonishing speed, the most famous and most photographed woman on earth. She had a gift Charles conspicuously lacked, an instinctive warmth, a way of touching people and meeting their eyes that made millions feel she genuinely cared, because she genuinely did. She held the hands of AIDS patients at a time when much of the public still feared to touch them. She knelt to speak to children at their own level. The cameras adored her, and the contrast with her formal, reserved husband became, over the decade, impossible to miss and impossible to forgive. He had married a woman who outshone him at the one thing the public most wanted from royalty, which was to be loved, and by many accounts the imbalance curdled something between them. By 1986, according to Diana's later account, she had become convinced that Charles had resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Whether that conviction was accurate to the year, or whether it ran ahead of the facts, is exactly the point on which the two of them disagreed. But from that point the marriage, in Diana's telling, was effectively over in everything but name, and the two of them began to live increasingly separate lives behind the unbroken public facade. Then the facade began to crack, and once it started, it could not be stopped. The press, sensing a story far bigger than a happy royal marriage, went to war, and the couple, disastrously, began briefing against each other through intermediaries and sympathetic journalists. Diana's cooperation with Andrew Morton's explosive 1992 biography, which laid out her unhappiness in devastating detail, was not publicly confirmed at the time, but its contents detonated under the monarchy. Charles had his own allies in the press telling his side. The marriage had become a public contest over who was the victim and who was to blame, fought in newspapers and on magazine covers, with two children caught in the middle of it. In December 1992, the inevitable was announced. The Prime Minister, John Major, stood up in the House of Commons and informed Parliament that the Prince and Princess of Wales had agreed to separate. The fairy tale that 750 million people had watched 11 years earlier was officially over. The palace insisted, hopefully and unconvincingly, that there was no constitutional implication and that Diana could still one day be queen. Almost no one believed it. And then in the same dreadful year came the most humiliating blow of all, and it landed on Charles. A recording surfaced. It was an intimate, late-night telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, secretly intercepted and recorded several years earlier. And now its transcript was splashed across the newspapers in all its excruciating private detail. The conversation was tender, and it was also, in places, crude and joking in the way that private lovers can be, and one particular fragment of it, a strange and intimate joke Charles made, was so bizarre and so mortifying that it became the title under which the whole scandal was filed. The tabloids called it Camillagate, or by the cruder name drawn from the joke itself. Overnight, the future king and supreme governor of the Church of England was exposed not merely as an unfaithful husband, but as one whose most private murmurings to his mistress were now public property, to be laughed at over breakfast tables across the country. It is difficult to imagine a more total collapse of dignity. Whatever sympathy Charles might have retained as a man trapped in an unhappy marriage drained away in the face of the recording. He was no longer the long-suffering husband. He was the cheating prince with the humiliating tape. For Camilla, the consequences were brutal and would last for years. She became, almost overnight, the most hated woman in Britain, blamed in the popular press for wrecking the marriage of the beloved princess. She was jeered in public. Bread rolls were reportedly thrown at her in a supermarket. Her own marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles, already long hollow, ended in divorce in 1995. She retreated almost entirely from public view, a private woman caught in the white heat of a national drama she had not asked to play the lead in. And Charles, his reputation in ruins, his marriage publicly dead, his most intimate words a national joke, faced a choice. He could disown Camilla, the woman he had loved since before any of it began, sacrifice her to save his own standing, and try to rebuild his image as a chastened, solitary heir. Or he could refuse. He could decide that having lost her once through hesitation, he would not lose her again through cowardice, whatever it cost him in the eyes of the public. The decision he made in those years, to stand by Camilla and to begin the long, patient, deeply unfashionable work of one day making her acceptable to the nation, is one of the most revealing things he ever did. It would take more than a decade. It would require a discipline and a stubbornness that his critics never credited him with. And it cuts hard against the idea of a cold man incapable of attachment, because whatever else you call a man who spends 10 years rehabilitating the reputation of the woman he loves in the face of national loathing, you cannot honestly call it coldness. But all of that was still ahead. In the immediate aftermath of the separation and the tape, Charles was at the lowest point of his public life, and it was about to get lower, because the contest with Diana was not over. Each of them still had one more card to play, and they would play them on television, in front of the entire country, in 2 interviews that would become the most famous and most damaging either of them ever gave. Charles would go first. In 1994 he would sit down in front of a camera and do something no heir had ever done, something that still astonishes the historians who study the monarchy. He would confess, and then Diana would answer him and bury him. That is where we go next. By the early 1990s, Charles had a problem that no amount of charity work could solve. The public had decided who he was, and the verdict was not kind. He was the man who had married a fairy tale princess and failed her. He was the husband whose secret love affair had been exposed in a tape too humiliating to repeat at the dinner table. And he was, increasingly, the villain in a story whose heroine the entire world adored. The separation had been announced. The marriage was finished in all but the legal paperwork, and Charles, advised by people who believed his side of events deserved a hearing, made a decision that constitutional historians still struggle to explain. He decided to put himself on television and tell the truth. The vehicle was a documentary made with the broadcaster and writer Jonathan Dimbleby, filmed over many months, titled Charles, the Private Man, the Public Role. It was meant to rehabilitate him. It was an enormous, ambitious project, reportedly drawing on around 180 hours of footage, shot over roughly 18 months, and its purpose was to show the country the serious, hard-working, thoughtful prince behind the tabloid caricature. There was Charles the charity founder, Charles the environmentalist, Charles the devoted, if awkward, father. For long stretches the film did exactly what it set out to do, presenting a man of substance and genuine public commitment. And then Dimbleby asked the question, and the entire effort came undone in a single sentence. He asked Charles, directly, whether he had been faithful and honourable during his marriage. A more careful man, a colder and more calculating man, would have deflected. He would have given a smooth non-answer, said something about the privacy owed to his family, and moved on. Charles did not. He said yes, he had been faithful, and then he added the qualification that destroyed him. He had been faithful, he said, until the marriage had become irretrievably broken down, both of them having tried. In that moment in June 1994, the heir to the throne and the future Supreme Governor of the Church of England admitted adultery to the entire nation on television. He did not name Camilla, he did not have to, everyone knew. Dimbleby himself would later identify her as the woman in question. The qualification Charles had attached, the insistence that the betrayal came only after the marriage was already dead, was, in his own mind, the crucial point, the thing that made the confession an act of honesty rather than shame. But the public did not hear the qualification. The public heard a prince admit he had cheated, and the careful context evaporated in the roar of the headlines. Why did he do it? One of his own senior aides at the time asked exactly that question afterward, gave an answer that says more about Charles than any psychological theory could. He simply did not know why Charles had answered, except that Charles would have answered as he felt was honest. There it is again, the same instinct that produced whatever in love means at his engagement. When asked a direct question about his own conduct, Charles found it nearly impossible to lie. It was not strength exactly, and it was not quite naivety either, though there was naivety in failing to foresee how the answer would land. It was a kind of compulsive truthfulness that worked against his own interests at almost every important moment of his public life. Charles even wrote privately to a friend afterward, describing the experience of the broadcast as what was called living dangerously. He knew, on some level, what he had done. He had told the truth, and he understood that telling the truth had cost him. The confession was a catastrophe for his image, but it was not the end of the war. Because Diana had been watching, and Diana had her own version to tell, and she was about to tell it in a way that would make Charles's televised honesty look like a warm-up act. On the 20th of November, 1995, the BBC Current Affairs programme Panorama broadcast an interview that nearly 23 million people in Britain alone sat down to watch. It had been filmed in secret in Diana's own sitting room at Kensington Palace by a journalist named Martin Bashir. The princess had not sought the palace's permission, she had simply done it and let the palace find out afterward. And what she delivered, in 55 minutes of quiet, devastating composure, was the most effective act of public communication anyone in the royal family had attempted in living memory. She spoke with a stillness that made every word land. She talked about her bulimia, describing it without shame as a symptom of a misery no one around her had wanted to see. She talked about the postnatal depression that had followed the birth of her children, and the loneliness that had swallowed her inside the institution. And then she said the sentence that has outlived almost everything else either of them ever uttered. Asked about the difficulties in her marriage, she said there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She named Camilla Parker Bowles as the 3rd person. She also, in the same interview, admitted to her own affair with a former army officer named James Hewitt, who had once been her riding instructor. But it was the line about the crowded marriage that the world remembered, because in a single image it recast the entire story. She was no longer one half of a failed couple. She was the wronged woman, alone in a marriage that had always belonged to someone else. The effect was overwhelming, and it was almost entirely in Diana's favour. A poll taken by one tabloid after the broadcast reportedly found that 3 out of 4 callers sided with the princess. The public, which had been drifting toward her for years, now committed completely. Charles was the cold husband, Camilla was the cause. Diana was the victim, and a beautiful, articulate, sympathetic victim at that. There is a bitter twist to the Panorama interview, and it would not emerge for another quarter of a century, but it belongs in any honest account of these events. The interview, it turned out, had been obtained through deceit. Years later, after a formal independent investigation led by the senior judge Lord Dyson, it was established that Martin Bashir had used forged bank statements to gain the trust of Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, and through him to win Diana's confidence and secure the interview. The fakery was real, and it was serious enough that the BBC issued apologies. The interview was effectively withdrawn from circulation, and Diana's son, Prince William, released a rare and pointed public statement saying the interview should never have taken place and contributed to his mother's fear and paranoia in her final years. None of this changes the truth of what Diana felt, and none of it makes Charles's own admitted infidelity any less real. But it does mean that the single most damaging blow ever struck against Charles in the court of public opinion was in part the product of a journalist's dishonesty. History is rarely as clean as the headlines that make it. In 1995, though, none of that was known. In 1995, the damage was simply total. The Queen, watching her son's reputation and the monarchy's standing erode by the week, decided the limbo could not continue. In December 1995, she wrote to both Charles and Diana, urging them, as sovereign and as mother, to divorce. They agreed. The negotiations were difficult and at times bitter, particularly over Diana's title and her future role. The decree was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. Diana lost the style of Her Royal Highness, but kept the title of Princess of Wales and remained closely involved in the lives of her sons. The marriage that had begun before 750 million witnesses ended quietly in a lawyer's settlement 15 years after it started. For Charles, the divorce should have been a kind of release. The pretense was over. He was free, at last, to live honestly, even if he could not yet live openly with the woman he loved. He could begin slowly to rebuild, and he did begin. In the year after the divorce, there were small, careful signs of a man trying to find his footing again, including, in July 1997, a 50th birthday party he hosted for Camilla at Highgrove, a quiet but unmistakable signal that she was a permanent part of his life, and that he intended eventually for the world to accept it. And then, 5 weeks after that party, on the 31st of August 1997, everything changed in a way no one could have planned for or recovered from quickly. Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old. The car she was travelling in, with her companion Dodi Fayed, crashed in a road tunnel while being pursued at speed by photographers on motorcycles. Dodi was killed, as was the driver. Diana died of her injuries in hospital in the early hours of the morning. The most famous woman in the world, the people's princess, the mother of the future king, was gone, suddenly and senselessly, in the middle of the night, hunted to the last by the cameras that had made and tormented her. The grief that followed was unlike anything modern Britain had ever witnessed. The public response was vast, raw, and in places frightening in its intensity. An ocean of flowers piled up outside the royal palaces. People wept openly in the streets, and almost immediately, the grief curdled into anger, and the anger looked for a target. Some of it found Charles. In the eyes of millions, fairly or not, here was the cold husband who had broken her, and now she was dead, young and beautiful, and finally free of him and of the family that had failed her. The narrative wrote itself, and it was merciless. But the immediate fury of those days fell hardest not on Charles but on the Queen, who, following royal protocol and her own instinct for privacy and grief, remained at Balmoral with her grandsons, and declined at first to make the public displays the nation demanded. The press turned on the monarchy itself, and in that crisis something unexpected happened, something that complicates the picture of Charles as the unfeeling villain. Behind the scenes, by multiple later accounts, it was Charles who pushed hardest for the royal family to respond to the public mood, who understood the danger the institution was in, and who insisted on flying to Paris himself to bring Diana's body home. Whatever his failures as a husband, in the days after her death he was, by these accounts, the one who grasped what needed to be done, both for the monarchy and for his two grieving boys, then aged 15 and 12, because that is the part of the story most easily forgotten in the rush to assign blame. Charles was, suddenly, a single father to two sons who had lost their mother in the most public and traumatic way imaginable. Whatever else can be said about him, the record of the years that followed is the record of a father who was present for his children's grief, who walked behind his former wife's coffin alongside his sons in front of the watching world, and who tried, in his guarded and imperfect way, to shield William and Harry from the worst of what was happening around them. The man the public had decided was cold was, in that moment, doing the warmest and hardest thing a parent can do, which is to hold himself together for the sake of children who are falling apart. The death of Diana sank Charles's public standing to a depth from which many believed it would never recover. There was serious, sustained speculation that he would never be king at all, that the crown would pass over him entirely and go directly to William, who carried his mother's glamour and none of his father's baggage. The idea was discussed openly. For a man who had waited his entire life for the throne, who had built a whole identity around the patient endurance of the heir, to be told by a significant portion of the country that he was now unfit to wear the crown must have been a peculiar kind of agony. He had done everything he had been raised to do. He had served, waited, worked, founded charities and prepared. And a car crash in a Paris tunnel, and the years of unhappiness that preceded it, had seemingly put the prize forever out of reach. What Charles did over the next several years is, by any measure, one of the most quietly remarkable acts of public rehabilitation in modern British history, and it was built on two foundations. The first was his sons. He devoted himself, as far as his role allowed, to William and Harry, and the public, watching, slowly began to see a father rather than a villain. The second foundation was the most audacious and the most revealing. He set out, deliberately and patiently, to rehabilitate Camilla, the woman the country still blamed for everything, and to do it so gradually that the nation would accept her without ever quite noticing it was being asked to. The strategy was sometimes called, by the people who managed his public affairs, a long and careful operation, and it was. Camilla was introduced to public life by tiny degrees. She appeared first only at the edges, then at events, then, in a carefully staged moment in 1999, leaving a London hotel at the same time as Charles, allowing the press its first sanctioned photograph of the couple together in public. There was no announcement, no defiance, no demand that the country approve. There was only a slow, relentless normalization, year after year, each small step calculated to let the public's hatred cool by a single degree. It required extraordinary discipline, and it required Charles to absorb years of continued hostility toward the woman he loved without ever once abandoning her or losing his patience with the project. It worked. Slowly, grudgingly, the country came around. The woman who had once had bread rolls thrown at her in a supermarket became, over the better part of a decade, a tolerated and then an accepted figure. And on the 9th of April, 2005, Charles and Camilla were married in a civil ceremony at Windsor, followed by a service of blessing. There were complications, theological and constitutional, around the remarriage of two divorced people, and the wedding was modest by royal standards, but it happened. The woman he had loved since before Diana, since before any of it, was finally, publicly, permanently his wife. She took the title of Duchess of Cornwall, choosing not to use the title Princess of Wales out of deference to the memory of the woman who had held. It had taken more than 30 years, 2 marriages, a national tragedy, and the patient endurance of a decade of loathing to bring it about. You can judge that story however your conscience directs. You can see in it a man who put his own desires ahead of his duty and his first wife's happiness, and there is truth in that judgment. Or you can see in it a man who, having lost the love of his life once through hesitation, refused to lose her a second time through cowardice, and who showed a loyalty and a constancy that few of his critics ever matched in their own lives. Both readings are available, and an honest account does not pretend to resolve them. What it cannot do, what the record simply will not allow, is to call the man at the centre of it cold. A cold man does not spend 30 years in pursuit of one woman and absorb a nation's contempt to keep her and marry her at last in the teeth of every objection. Whatever Charles was, in this at least he was steadfast to the point of stubbornness, and the stubbornness was a form of love. By 2005, then, the impossible had largely been achieved. Charles was remarried to the woman he loved. His sons were grown. The worst of the public fury had burned itself out, and the throne, written off as lost after Diana's death, was quietly back within reach, because his mother, though still vigorous, could not reign forever, and the country, its anger spent, had begun once again to think of Charles not as the man who failed Diana, but simply as the next king. But the throne was still years away, and the years of waiting were not finished with him. There was more work to do, more controversy to come, and a set of financial scandals gathering on the horizon that would test, All over again, the question this whole film keeps returning to: whether the private Charles, the man behind the palace doors, was better or worse than the public one. That is where we turn next, to the money, the favours, and the aide who served him for 40 years. There is a version of Charles that his admirers like to tell, and it is largely true. The tireless founder of charities. The man who built the Prince's Trust from a naval severance check into an organisation that changed hundreds of thousands of lives. The environmentalist decades ahead of his time. It is a genuine record of genuine good, and nothing in this part is meant to erase it. But there is another record running alongside it, and it is not so flattering, and an honest account has to hold both at the same time, because the same charitable empire that did so much good was also, over the years, the source of some of the most serious questions ever raised about Charles's judgment. Questions about money, about favours, about what was promised to wealthy donors and what was given in return, and about how much the prince at the centre of it all really knew. To understand those questions, you have to understand one man, because for 40 years he stood closer to Charles than almost anyone else alive. His name was Michael Fawcett. Fawcett began at the very bottom. He joined the royal household in 1981, the same year Charles married Diana, starting as a junior footman to the Queen, before becoming a personal valet to her eldest son. And from that humble beginning he rose, over 4 decades, to become one of the most powerful and trusted figures in Charles's entire world. He was famously, almost legendarily, indispensable. The stories about the closeness of the relationship became part of royal folklore. It was said, only half in jest, that Fawcett was the one man Charles could not function without. The fixer who made the prince's complicated life run smoothly, who anticipated his needs, who handled the things no one else could handle. When scandals in earlier years forced Fawcett out of the household, Charles brought him back, again and again, because Charles, by all accounts, simply did not want to be without him. There is even a much-repeated anecdote, never confirmed and possibly apocryphal, that captures the public perception of the bond, the idea that Fawcett's duties extended to the most personal and undignified corners of the prince's daily routine. Whether that particular story is true hardly matters. What matters is what it represents, which is a dependence so total that it raised, in the minds of critics, an obvious and uncomfortable question. If Fawcett did everything for Charles, and knew everything about Charles, then how much did Charles know about what Fawcett did in his name? That question moved from gossip to criminal investigation in 2021. By then, Fawcett was the chief executive of the Prince's Foundation, one of Charles's principal charities. And in the autumn of 2021, a series of newspaper reports, led by the Sunday Times, alleged something genuinely serious. They alleged that Fawcett had offered to help a wealthy Saudi donor secure a British honour, and even help with an application for British citizenship, in connection with very large donations to Charles's charitable causes. The donor was a Saudi businessman named Mahfouz Mari Mubarak bin Mahfouz. He had given substantial sums, reportedly around £1.5 million, to restoration projects close to Charles's heart, including work at Dumfries House in Scotland and the Castle of May, one of the family's beloved residences. In 2015, a forest at one of those properties had even been renamed in the donor's honour, and in 2016, Mahfouz had received an honorary CBE, presented at a private ceremony that did not appear on the official list of royal engagements. Then the leaked documents surfaced, a letter, reportedly from 2017, in which Fawcett appeared to tell the donor's representatives that he was willing to support an application to upgrade the donor's honour and to assist with citizenship in light of his generosity. Other communications suggested an even more explicit understanding that the honour had been, in effect, promised in exchange for the money. The phrase that hung over the whole affair was an old and damning one: cash for honours. The response was swift. Fawcett temporarily stepped down, then resigned altogether in November 2021, ending a 40-year relationship with Charles in disgrace. A friend told the press that the accusations had devastated him, that he had lost a great deal of weight and become a shadow of himself. The Prince's Foundation launched an independent investigation, which found that Fawcett had indeed coordinated with so-called fixers in an effort to secure the honour for the donor, and in February 2022, The Metropolitan Police announced that they were opening a formal criminal investigation into the allegations, examining possible offences under the Prevention of Abuses Act of 1925, a law nearly a century old and very rarely invoked. A file of evidence was eventually passed to the Crown Prosecution Service. Here is where fairness demands precision, because the temptation in a story like this is to assume the worst and move on, and the record does not actually support assuming the worst about Charles personally. Throughout the entire affair, Clarence House, Charles's official office, stated firmly and consistently that the Prince of Wales had no knowledge of any alleged offer of honours or citizenship in exchange for donations to his charities. Charles was never arrested. He was never charged. There was speculation that he might be interviewed by police as a witness, but the investigation, as these things often do, eventually went quiet, and no charges were ever brought against Charles himself. On the evidence available, there is no proof that the future king personally orchestrated or even knew about the specific arrangements his closest aide was accused of making. But this is where the critics raise the obvious objection, and it is not an unreasonable one. The former Liberal Democrat MP Norman Baker, a long-standing critic of royal finances, put it bluntly at the time. The idea, he said, that Michael Fawcett was doing things Prince Charles knew nothing about was, in his view, nonsense. Fawcett was not some distant employee. He was the single closest aide to Charles for 4 decades, the man who knew everything, the man Charles trusted above all others. And so the public was left with 2 possibilities, neither of them comfortable. Either Charles genuinely did not know what his most trusted confidant was doing in the name of his charities, which raises hard questions about how loosely he supervised the people closest to him, or he did know, in which case the official denials do not hold. The truth may lie in the grey space between, in the way powerful people often arrange not to be told the details of things they would rather not have to know. The record does not resolve it. What the record does establish is that a charity bearing Charles's name, run by Charles's closest aide, became the subject of a criminal investigation into the sale of honours, and that is a serious stain regardless of what Charles personally knew. The Fawcett affair was the most legally serious of the financial controversies, but it was not the only one, and the others painted a picture of a man with a curiously casual attitude toward very large sums of money from foreign sources. In June 2022, the Sunday Times reported another extraordinary story. Over a period of years, between 2011 and 2015, Charles had personally accepted cash donations totaling €3 million, around £2.5 million, from a single Qatari politician, Sheikh Hamad bin Yassim bin Yabir Al Thani, who had served as the Prime Minister of Qatar. The donations were destined for the Prince of Wales's charitable fund. There was no suggestion that the payments themselves were illegal, and that point deserves to be stated clearly. But it was the manner of the handovers that astonished people. According to the reporting, the money was handed to Charles in person, at private meetings, and not by bank transfer or cheque, as one might expect for charitable donations of that size. On one occasion, the cash was reportedly handed over in a suitcase. On another, the money, €1 million in banknotes, was said to be stuffed inside shopping bags from Fortnum and Mason, the luxury London department store. The future King of England, in other words, was alleged to have personally taken carrier bags full of foreign cash from a foreign politician. Charles's office, Clarence House, defended the arrangement. It stated that the donations had been passed immediately to one of the prince's charities, that the proper governance processes had been followed, and that the charity's auditors had signed off on the donations after specific inquiry. The Charity Commission, the official regulator, looked into the matter and concluded, within a matter of weeks, that there had been no failure of governance and that there was no further regulatory role for it to play. By the letter of the rules, in other words, nothing improper had occurred, and yet the image lingered, because images do. There is something about a future monarch accepting bags of cash that no amount of clean auditing can entirely wash away, and even the reporting that cleared him of any legal wrongdoing noted that the episode raised serious questions about his personal judgment. There was more. Around the same period, it emerged that the Prince of Wales's charitable fund had, in 2013, accepted a donation of £1 million from the family of Osama bin Laden. specifically from Bakr bin Laden, the patriarch of the wealthy Saudi construction dynasty, and his brother Shafiq, both half-brothers of the Al-Qaeda founder who had masterminded the September the 11th attacks just 12 years earlier. The fund insisted that the decision to accept the donation had been taken by its trustees alone, after due diligence, and that any suggestion Charles himself had brokered it was misleading. The reporting that revealed it suggested otherwise, that Charles had been personally involved in securing the money. The family name alone, regardless of the innocence of the particular individuals involved, made the donation a public relations disaster the moment it became known. Set these episodes side by side and a pattern emerges, and it is worth naming carefully, without exaggeration. None of them resulted in criminal charges against Charles. None of them, on the official findings, involved illegality on his part. But all of them, together, suggest a man whose charitable zeal sometimes outran his caution, who was willing to accept money from sources that more careful judgment would have refused, and who surrounded himself with aides like Fawcett, who were prepared to push at the edges of propriety on his behalf, while Charles maintained, with some plausibility and some convenience, that he did not know the details. It is not the portrait of a crook. It is the portrait of a man so accustomed to his causes being righteous that he stopped asking hard questions about where the support for those causes came from, and who trusted the wrong people to handle the parts he did not want to see. And that brings us to the other long-running accusation against the private Charles, the one that goes not to his honesty, but to his temperament. The accusation that behind the palace doors he was difficult, demanding, short-tempered, and at times unreasonable to the people who worked for him. This is the hardest part of his character to assess fairly, because so much of it lives in anonymous briefings and unverified anecdotes, and an honest account cannot treat staffroom gossip as established fact. What can be said is this: Charles was, by the accounts of many who worked for him over the years, a man of exacting standards and particular habits, accustomed to a level of personal service that strikes ordinary people as absurd. The stories of his fastidiousness became famous, his specific preferences, the precise way things had to be arranged for him, the entourage required to maintain a prince's daily life at the standard he expected. To his critics, this was evidence of a spoiled and out-of-touch man. To his defenders, it was simply the reality of a life lived entirely inside an institution that had treated him as a symbol since before he could walk. Then there were the temper moments, and a handful of them were not anonymous gossip at all, because they were caught on camera in the very first days of his reign, when the strain of his mother's death and the weight of the role he had waited 73 years for were pressing on him all at once. In September 2022, just after he became king, Charles was filmed at a signing ceremony becoming visibly irritated by a leaking fountain pen that smudged his hand, gesturing in frustration and muttering about the mess as he handed it to an aide. On another occasion in those same days, he was seen impatiently waving away a tray of pens and an inkwell that were in his way at a desk. The clips went viral. To some they were proof of the petulant, entitled man the legend had always described. To others they were the entirely human reactions of an exhausted, grieving man in his 70s, thrust into the most scrutinized job on earth in the worst week of his life, snapping over a trivial annoyance the way any tired person might. Both readings, again, are available. What the clips genuinely show is a man under immense pressure whose composure, that lifelong composure built in the cold halls of Gordonstoun, had momentarily cracked, and who was caught on camera in the act of being ordinary and irritable rather than regal. It is a small thing, a leaking pen, but it is revealing precisely because it is small. Here was a man who had spent his entire life keeping his feelings off his face, and the one time the public reliably saw the mask slip, it slipped over something trivial, in a moment of grief and exhaustion, and the entire country watched and drew its conclusions. The man who could confess adultery on television with composure lost his temper over a pen. The control that had defined him since boyhood was real, but it was not infinite, and the cracks, when they showed at the strangest moments. So who was the private Charles, on the evidence of the money and the temper and the 40-year dependence on a single aide? Not a saint, certainly. A man of genuine charitable achievement who was also careless about the company his charity kept. a man of formidable self-control who could still snap over nothing, a man who inspired 40 years of devotion from those closest to him, and who may have known more, or less, than he admitted about what that devotion led them to do. He is harder to pin down than either his enemies or his friends would like, which is, perhaps, the truest thing that can be said about him. But all of this, the charities and the scandals and the long apprenticeship, was still the story of the prince. The story of the king had not yet begun. For that, the country had to wait for the one event that everyone knew was coming and no one wished to name. The death of the woman who had occupied the throne for 70 years and who stood, her entire life, between Charles and the crown he had been born to wear. That is where we go next. For 70 years, one woman had stood between Charles and the throne. She was his mother, and he loved her, and the cruel arithmetic of his position meant that the only path to the role he had been born for ran directly through her death. He could never say so, he could never even let himself fully think it, but every person who waits to be king is, by the simple fact of waiting, waiting for a funeral, and Charles had been waiting longer than any heir in the history of the British monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral, her beloved estate in the Scottish Highlands, on the 8th of September 2022. She was 96 years old, and she had reigned for 70 years and 214 days, the longest reign of any British monarch, and one of the longest of any sovereign in recorded history. She had come to the throne as a young woman of 25, when Charles was a toddler of 3, and she had occupied it with a steadiness that became the defining feature of British public life, through 15 prime ministers and the better part of a century of upheaval. For almost everyone alive in Britain on the day she died, she was the only monarch they had ever known, and for Charles, she was the mother he had spent his whole life beneath, and the obstacle, never to be named as such, between him and his destiny. The manner of the transition revealed something about him, and about the strangeness of his entire life, that is easy to miss in the solemnity of the occasion. In the eyes of the law and the Constitution, Charles became king in the very instant his mother stopped breathing. There is no gap, there is no interregnum. The monarchy does not pause to mourn before it continues. The old formula, the moment one sovereign dies the next succeeds, is literal and immediate. And so a man who had been the Prince of Wales for 64 years, the longest anyone had ever held that title, ceased to be the prince and became the king between 1 second and the next, on the afternoon of a September day, in a house in Scotland, beside his mother's body. He was 73 years old. He was, by a wide margin, the oldest person ever to accede to the British throne. The previous record holder, William IV, had been 64. Charles had outwaited every heir in 1,000 years of the institution, and he came to the crown not as a young man full of promise, but as an old man whose hair had long since greyed and whose own health was no longer guaranteed. The prize he had been promised in the cradle arrived when most men are deep into retirement, and it arrived wrapped in grief, because to receive it he had first to lose his mother. The days that followed were a strange and ancient piece of national theatre, and Charles, who had been rehearsing for them in a sense his entire life, performed his part with a composure that surprised even some of his critics. There was the Accession Council at St. James's Palace, where he was formally proclaimed King Charles III, an old ceremony broadcast on television for the first time in history, in which the new sovereign swears his oaths before the assembled grandees of the realm. He chose to reign under his own first name, Charles, rather than one of his other names, becoming Charles III, a choice that carried its own quiet weight, given that the previous 2 King Charleses had reigns marked by civil war and scandal. He addressed the nation in a televised broadcast the day after his mother's death, speaking of her with evident emotion and pledging himself to the lifelong service she had embodied. He spoke directly to his sons and, in a passage that drew particular notice, expressed his love for Harry and Meghan as they continued building their lives abroad, a gesture of warmth toward an estranged son in a moment of national grief. And then there was the period of mourning, 10 days of it, culminating in the largest state funeral Britain had staged in generations, watched by an estimated audience in the billions worldwide. Charles walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London, as he had walked behind Diana's a quarter of a century before, the grieving son, now also the reigning king, the two roles fused into one exhausting public performance of duty, the lifelong training held. He did what was required, in the way it was required, and the institution passed from one reign to the next without a stumble, exactly as it was designed to do. It was during these very first days, as we've seen, that the famous cracks appeared. The leaking pen, the impatient gesture at the inkwell, the small eruptions of irritation caught on camera in the most pressured week of his life. They are worth remembering here, not to mock him, but because they sit so revealingly beside the composure of the larger occasion. Charles managed the immense ceremonial weight of becoming king while grieving his mother, and he did it with dignity, and the only time he visibly faltered was over office stationery. The mask he had worn since boyhood held for the cameras of the world and slipped only over a pen. It is almost a parable of the whole man. Immense control over the things that matter most, and a strange brittleness over the things that matter least. If you have found this portrait worth your time so far, the honest version that refuses both the halo and the pitchfork, then take a moment to subscribe before we go on, because the second half of this story, the reign itself, and the illness that struck at the heart of it, is where the question of who Charles really is comes to its sharpest point. The coronation came the following spring. On the 6th of May 2023, 8 months after his accession, Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony whose roots stretch back more than 1,000 years, in essentially unbroken form, to the crowning of Anglo-Saxon kings. He was anointed with holy oil, presented with the orb and the sceptre, and crowned with the St. Edward's crown, the same heavy golden crown used to crown his mother 70 years earlier. Camilla, the woman the country had once hated, the woman he had spent 30 years patiently making acceptable, was crowned alongside him as queen. It was the culmination of everything, the throne and the marriage and the long endurance, all of it ratified at last in the most sacred ceremony the nation possesses. And yet the coronation was a more muted and more complicated affair than the great spectacles of the past, and the difference said something about the country Charles had inherited and about Charles himself. He had insisted on a smaller, shorter, less extravagant ceremony than his mother's, more in keeping, as is said, with the times, and with his own long-held instincts about restraint. The guest list was trimmed, the ancient rituals were modernized at the edges, with a more visible role for other faiths and a recognition of a Britain that no longer looked or believed as it had in 1953. It was, in its way, a thoroughly Charles event, thoughtful, a little anxious about its own relevance, trying to honor tradition while quietly adapting it, and not entirely sure the country was still watching with the devotion it once had. Because the country had changed, and the monarchy's place in it was no longer the unquestioned thing it had been. Support for the institution, particularly among the young, was softer than it had ever been in living memory. There were protests at the coronation itself, anti-monarchy demonstrators arrested in central London on the day, a sight that would have been almost unthinkable at his mother's crowning. Republican sentiment, long a fringe position in Britain, had grown into something a serious king could no longer simply ignore. Charles came to the throne, not as the unchallenged sovereign of a deferential people, but as the elderly head of an institution whose long-term future was for the first time in generations a genuine open question. The crown he had waited his whole life for was, when he finally put it on, lighter in the public imagination than it had ever been. This was, perhaps, the central irony of his accession, and it is worth sitting with. Charles had spent more than 7 decades preparing to be king. He had studied the role, shadowed his mother, built his charities, formed his opinions, and endured every humiliation the long wait threw at him, all in service of a moment that, when it finally arrived, found the very institution he was inheriting diminished and uncertain. He had trained his entire life to captain a ship whose passengers were increasingly wondering whether they wanted to be aboard at all. The throne was his at last, and the throne mattered less than it once had. Few men have ever achieved a lifelong ambition under such melancholy circumstances. But Charles, whatever his flaws, was not a man to be defeated by melancholy circumstances. He had, after all, built an entire identity out of patient endurance, out of doing the work without expectation of reward, out of being underestimated and carrying on regardless. And so he set about the business of being king, with the same diligence he had brought to everything else. He held his weekly audiences with the Prime Minister. He read his red boxes. He undertook the engagements, the state visits, the ribbon cuttings and the speeches. He brought to the throne the causes he had championed for decades, the environment above all, and he discovered, with what must have been a quiet satisfaction, that the concerns for which he had been mocked as a crank 30 years earlier were now mainstream, urgent and broadly shared. The plant-talking eccentric had, it turned out, been right about a great deal, and ahead of his time, and the throne now gave him a platform to say so as head of state, rather than as a meddling prince. There was also the matter of the family he now headed, and it was not a peaceful one. The monarchy Charles inherited was riven by the estrangement of his younger son. Harry and Meghan had stepped back from royal duties in 2020 and relocated to California, and the rupture had only deepened in the years since, played out in interviews, in a Netflix series, and in Harry's own explosive memoir. The grief Charles must have felt at the breach with the son whose mother had died so young, the son he had walked beside behind two coffins now, is something the record only glimpses. He referred to his love for Harry in his very first address as king. The two reportedly spoke when Charles's own illness was later announced. But the distance remained, public and painful, a wound at the centre of the royal family that the new king could not heal, however much he may have wished to. The man who had spent his life keeping his feelings hidden now presided over a family whose deepest divisions were conducted in the full glare of the world's media, and there was very little, as king, that he could do about it except endure, which was the one thing he had always known how to do. And so by the start of 2024, the picture seemed, against all the odds, to have settled into something like stability. Charles was king, crowned and anointed, married to the woman he loved, his lifelong ambition fulfilled even in its diminished form. The scandals of the charity years had faded from the headlines. The transition from his mother's reign had been managed without disaster. He was old, and he had come to the throne late. But he was there, and he was doing the job he had been born for, and there was every reason to expect a quiet, dutiful reign of perhaps a decade or more, a gentle bridge between his mother's long era and the eventual reign of his elder son. That expectation lasted almost exactly 1 year. Because in early 2024, less than 12 months after the coronation, the king went into hospital for a routine procedure, and the doctors found something they had not been looking for, and the reign that had taken 73 years to begin was suddenly, frighteningly, called into question by the one adversary that even kings cannot command. That is where we turn next. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It began, as these things so often do, with something small and unalarming. In January 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that the king would be undergoing treatment for an enlarged prostate. The wording was deliberately calm, almost mundane. The condition, the palace said, was benign. He would have a corrective procedure, the kind, the statement noted pointedly, that thousands of men undergo every year. There was even a quiet purpose behind the unusual candor. By naming the condition plainly, the palace hoped to encourage other men to get themselves checked, and in the days after the announcement, searches for information about prostate health reportedly surged across Britain. It was, at that stage, a story about a 75-year-old man having a common operation and a king using his own minor ailment to do a little public good. On the 26th of January, he went into the London Clinic, a private hospital in central London, for the procedure. By coincidence, his daughter-in-law, the Princess of Wales, was recovering in the same hospital at the same time, having undergone major abdominal surgery the week before. The two health stories ran side by side in the press, and at that point neither seemed especially grave. The king left hospital, returned to royal life, and the matter appeared closed. It was not closed. During the procedure for the benign prostate condition, the doctors had noticed something else. A separate issue of concern, in the careful language the palace would later use. Subsequent diagnostic tests were carried out, and those tests identified what no one had gone looking for. The king had cancer. On the 5th of February 2024, Buckingham Palace made the announcement that stopped the country in its tracks. King Charles III had been diagnosed with a form of cancer and had already begun a course of treatment. The statement was notably sparse on detail. It did not specify the type of cancer, though it stated clearly that it was not prostate cancer, and it gave no information about the stage or the severity. The king would step back from public-facing duties while undergoing treatment, though he would continue with the constitutional paperwork and the state business that only the sovereign can perform. And the palace explained why it had chosen to make the diagnosis public at all, when it could so easily have kept it private. The king had elected to share the news, the statement said, in the hope that it might prevent speculation and help the public understanding of all those around the world affected by cancer. He had been, after all, a patron of cancer charities for years. He knew the value of a famous face speaking openly about a disease that so many face in silence and fear. That decision to go public deserves a moment of reflection, because it cuts against everything the legend of the secretive, controlling Charles would lead you to expect. This was a man raised to reveal nothing, who had spent 7 decades keeping his inner life hidden, who came from an institution whose deepest instinct in the face of any private difficulty was silence. His own mother had guarded the details of her health with absolute discretion to the very end. And yet Charles, faced with a cancer diagnosis in the first year of the reign he had waited his whole life for, chose to tell the world. He did not have to. The Constitution did not require it. The family tradition argued against it. He did it because he had decided, as he had decided years earlier in that televised confession, that a certain kind of honesty was worth more than the protection of silence. The same compulsive truthfulness that had cost him so dearly in 1994 now served a far better purpose, turning his own illness into a quiet act of public service. The man the public had called cold used the worst news of his life to try to help strangers he would never meet. The diagnosis landed in the middle of what was already becoming a catastrophic year for the royal family's health, and the scale of it is worth grasping. Barely a month after the king's cancer was announced, in March 2024, the Princess of Wales, Catherine, revealed that she too had been diagnosed with cancer, discovered following her own abdominal surgery, and that she had begun a course of preventative chemotherapy. She was just 42 years old, the mother of 3 young children, and the future queen. In the space of a few weeks, the 2 most senior working members of the royal family after the king's own generation, the reigning monarch and the wife of the heir, were both out of action, both undergoing cancer treatment, both facing the most frightening kind of uncertainty at once. It was a blow without modern precedent, and it left the institution dangerously thin on the ground, with the Princess of Wales withdrawn entirely, and the king limited, and the burden of public duty falling heavily on Queen Camilla, on Prince William, and on the small number of other working royals. Prince William, caught between his ailing father and his ailing wife, while raising 3 children and shouldering an increased load of royal duties, would later describe 2024 in stark terms. It was, he said, probably the hardest year of his life, a dreadful experience. It is one of the more human glimpses the family has ever offered, the future king admitting plainly that the year his father and his wife were both diagnosed with cancer was simply the worst of his life. Whatever the public thinks of the monarchy as an institution, the family inside it was, in 2024, going through exactly the kind of fear and grief that any family faces when illness strikes 2 of its members at once, with the added cruelty that they had to do it under the gaze of the entire world. For Charles, the irony was almost unbearable in its precision. He had waited 73 years for the crown. He had finally received it, been anointed and crowned, fulfilled the purpose of his entire existence. And then, with less than a year on the throne, the disease arrived to remind him that the time he had waited so long to reach might be far shorter than anyone had hoped. A man who had spent his whole life preparing for a future that took forever to come now, faced the possibility that the future, having finally arrived, might be cut off almost as soon as it began. There is a particular cruelty in that shape of a life, and Charles, by every account, met it not with self-pity, but with the same dutiful steadiness he had brought to everything else. He did not vanish entirely. Even during the most intensive phase of treatment, when public engagements were suspended, he continued the constitutional work, the red boxes of state papers that arrive for the sovereign every day without exception, and he allowed the public small reassuring glimpses. He was seen attending church, in a meeting with the Prime Minister, captured on camera in February 2024, when Rishi Sunak remarked that it was wonderful to see him looking so well. Charles deflected the compliment with a characteristically dry joke, saying it was all done by mirrors. It was a small moment but a telling one. Here was a man who had just received a cancer diagnosis, meeting the head of government, and reaching instinctively for self-deprecating humour to put the other person at ease. The famous reserve, in that instant, looked less like coldness, and more like a very British kind of grace under pressure, the refusal to make others uncomfortable with the weight of your own fear. By the spring of 2024 he had begun, cautiously, to return to public-facing duties. His first engagement back was, fittingly, a visit to a cancer treatment centre alongside Queen Camilla to meet medical specialists and patients facing the same battle he was facing. The palace said the king chose that destination deliberately. He wanted his return to public life to begin where his own struggle was being fought, among the doctors and the patients of the disease he now shared with them. Over the following months he gradually rebuilt his program of engagements, pacing himself, adapting. At the annual Trooping the Colour, the great military parade marking the sovereign's official birthday, he did not ride on horseback as he had in better health, opting instead for a carriage, a small visible concession to his condition. He undertook a state visit, hosting the Emperor and Empress of Japan. Step by step he resumed the life of a working king, treatment continuing in the background, the precise nature of his illness still undisclosed. The public was given no running commentary on the medical details, and the palace held firmly to that discretion. There was no announcement of a cancer type, no staging, no prognosis. What the public received instead were periodic, carefully worded updates, and the tone of them over the months grew steadily more hopeful. The treatment was continuing, the king was responding. He was, the palace let it be understood, in good spirits and frustrated mainly by the slow pace of his recovery and his eagerness to get back to a full schedule, which is, if anything, the complaint of a man whose instinct is to work rather than to rest. Then, in December 2025, came the most substantial update since the diagnosis, and it was good news. In a message, King shared that, thanks to early diagnosis, effective intervention, and what he wryly called adherence to doctors' orders, his schedule of cancer treatment could be reduced in the coming year. He was responding well. The disease, while not declared gone, was under control, and the relentless rhythm of treatment that had shadowed his reign since its first year was finally beginning to ease. He used the occasion, characteristically, not to dwell on his own ordeal, but to thank the cancer charities and the medical staff, and to reflect that his diagnosis had, in his words, brought the best of humanity into focus. A few months earlier, in a written message, he had said much the same, that facing the disease had shown him the kindness and compassion of people in a way that gave him hope. The Princess of Wales, for her part, completed her chemotherapy and was, by early 2025, reported to be in remission. The family had come through the worst of it, bruised, changed, reminded of its own mortality, but intact. And what does the illness and the way Charles met it finally tell us about the man this whole film has been trying to see clearly? It tells us, more plainly than almost anything else in his long life, that the cartoon was always too small. The cold and controlling figure of legend would have hidden his diagnosis, as his mother and her generation would have done, guarding the institution's mystique with silence. Charles did the opposite. He told the truth, knowing it would invite scrutiny and speculation and the morbid public arithmetic that attends any seriously ill king, and he told it specifically in the hope of helping other people facing the same disease in private terror. The controlling man surrendered control over his own most private medical news, deliberately for the benefit of strangers. The cold man used his suffering as an act of warmth. It is the same pattern that has run through his entire story, from the engagement to the confession to the cancer. Charles is at his most human and his most admirable, precisely in the moments when he stops protecting himself and tells an uncomfortable truth out loud. And he is at his most maligned in exactly those same moments, because the world has always preferred the smooth performance to the awkward honesty, and Charles has never been very good at the smooth performance. He could not say he was in love when he was not sure he was. He could not deny the affair when asked to his face. He could not keep his cancer a private royal secret when going public might do some good. The very honesty that the public read again and again as coldness or clumsiness or scandal was, on a closer look, something closer to its opposite. That is the case for a kinder verdict on Charles than the one history first handed him. But it is not the whole case, and an honest film does not stop at the kind verdict any more than it stops at the cruel one. There remain the real failures, the genuine coldnesses, the things that cannot be explained away as misunderstood honesty. There is the question of Diana, and whether a kinder man would have spared her what she suffered. There is the question of the charity money, and the aide who fell. There is the estranged son in California, and the grandchildren the king barely knows. The fuller reckoning, weighing the warmth against the failures, and trying to arrive at something like a fair final judgment, is what the remaining parts of this story will attempt. We turn next to the hardest question of all. Not what Charles did, but what kind of father, and what kind of man, the evidence finally reveals him to be. If you want to find the real measure of a man, the old wisdom says, look at how he raised his children. With Charles, the evidence is unusually rich, because his two sons grew up in the most documented family on earth, and both of them, in adulthood, have spoken at length and in public about the father who raised them. The trouble is that the two accounts do not entirely agree, and the gap between them has become one of the deepest and most painful divisions in the modern royal family. Start with the circumstances, because they were extraordinary, and they were not Charles's fault. William was born in 1982 and Harry in 1984, into a marriage that was already, by the accounts both parents later gave, under strain. They were small boys when their parents separated in 1992, when the Camilla tape was published, when the war of interviews played out across the nation's television screens. They were children when the most intimate failures of their parents' marriage became public property, dissected on magazine covers and discussed on talk shows, inescapable. No child should have to grow up watching strangers debate whether their father is a villain and their mother a victim or the reverse. But that is precisely the childhood William and Harry had. And then, when William was 15 and Harry just 12, their mother was killed in a Paris tunnel, and they were made to walk behind her coffin through the streets of London, while the entire world watched and wept and photographed their faces for grief. Harry has written in adulthood about the lasting trauma of that walk, of being a 12-year-old forced to perform composure in public on the worst day of his life. It is impossible to read his account of it without a pang, and impossible not to ask what it did to him. But it is also worth recording what Charles did in those days, because the record drawn from multiple accounts of the period suggests that the supposedly cold father was, in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, the parent who stepped up. It was Charles, by these accounts, who flew to Paris to bring his former wife's body home. It was Charles who broke the news to his sons and tried to comfort them, and it was Charles who, in the years that followed, became the single full-time parent to two boys who had lost their mother in the most traumatic way imaginable. By many accounts, including warm ones from people who knew the family well, Charles was a genuinely affectionate and attentive father in private, far more tactile and emotionally present than his own father had been with him. This is one of the quiet themes of his life that the public narrative tends to miss. Charles had endured a cold, distant upbringing, the boarding schools, the unhappiness at Gordonstoun, the rationed affection of a household run on duty, and the evidence suggests that he consciously tried to be a different kind of father, to give his sons the warmth he himself had lacked. He took them on holidays, involved himself in their interests, hugged them in public at a time when royal fathers did not, and after Diana's death tried, in his guarded way, to hold the small family together. The man who could not show his feelings to the cameras seems, behind the doors, to have shown them rather more freely to his boys. For most of their lives, the relationship between Charles and both sons appeared close and strong. William grew into the dutiful heir, dedicated to the institution, increasingly aligned with his father in the shared understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on the two of them. Harry, the second son, the spare in the old royal phrase, occupied a more difficult position, the one who would never be king, who was loved by the public for his warmth and his vulnerability, but who lacked the clear purpose that defined his brother's life. For years it worked. The image of the two princes, bonded by the shared trauma of their mother's death, standing together as the future of the monarchy, was one of the things that had helped rehabilitate the whole family in the public mind. And then it broke in public, and it has not been mended. The rupture is usually dated to 2020, when Harry and his wife Meghan Markle announced their decision to step back from their roles as senior working royals and to build an independent life, eventually settling in California. The departure, quickly dubbed Megxit by the inevitable tabloids, was negotiated in a tense series of meetings and emerged into public view as a painful, semi-public falling out over money, security, titles, and the terms on which the couple could leave. But the deeper causes ran further back and went much deeper. And over the following years, Harry and Meghan would lay them out for the world in a sequence of extraordinary public disclosures that left the royal family reeling and the relationship between Harry and his father in ruins. There was the interview with Oprah Winfrey in 2021, watched by tens of millions, in which the couple described their unhappiness inside the institution in devastating terms, alleged a lack of support and care, and made an allegation, never fully resolved in public, about a conversation within the family concerning the skin color of their unborn child. There was the Netflix documentary series, and then, in January 2023, just months before Charles's coronation, there was Harry's memoir, Spare, one of the fastest-selling non-fiction books in publishing history, in which Harry told his side of his entire life in unsparing detail, including his relationship with his father and his brother. The portrait of Charles in Harry's account is complicated, and to Harry's credit, it is not a simple hatchet job. There is real love in it and real longing. Harry writes of a father who was capable of tenderness, who struggled in his own way, who was himself a product of a cold upbringing and could not always give what his son needed. But there is also pain and accusation and a sense of a father who, in Harry's telling, prioritized the institution and his own position over the emotional needs of his younger son, who failed to protect Harry and Meghan from the hostility of the press, and who was, at crucial moments, emotionally unavailable in exactly the way the public legend would predict. Harry described a man who found physical affection difficult, who delivered the news of Diana's death without an embrace, who was loving but constrained, present but somehow withheld. Here, more than anywhere, the film must be careful, because we are now in the territory of a son's account of his father, given by one party to a painful family rupture, contested in its particulars by the other side, and impossible for any outsider to adjudicate. What Harry experienced as coldness, Charles may have experienced as the best he was able to give. What Harry remembers as abandonment, Charles and William reportedly remember very differently. Families in the grip of a deep estrangement rarely agree on the facts of their own history, because the facts are inseparable from the wounds, and each side tells the version that makes sense of its own pain. The honest position is not to declare Harry right or Charles right, but to recognize that two people who once loved each other deeply have arrived at irreconcilable accounts of why they no longer can, and that the truth, as ever, almost certainly lives somewhere in the contested space between them. What can be said with confidence is what the public record shows, and it shows a king carrying a wound at the center of his family that he cannot heal. In his very first address to the nation as king, in the rawest moment of his grief for his mother, Charles took the time to express his love for Harry and Meghan as they built their lives overseas. It was a deliberate gesture, a public hand extended to an estranged son at a moment of maximum visibility. When Charles' cancer was announced in 2024, Harry flew to Britain to see his father, and the two reportedly met, however briefly. There have been small signals over the years of a man who has not closed the door, who would, the evidence suggests, welcome a reconciliation if one were possible. But the distance has remained, public and unresolved, and as Charles has grown older and frailer, the unhealed breach with his younger son has become one of the genuine sorrows of his late life. The grandchildren he barely knows, Harry and Meghan's two children, are growing up an ocean away, and the time a cancer-stricken king has left to know them is not unlimited, and everyone involved understands that, and still the gap does not close. It is a painful thing to watch, and it resists the easy moral that both sides' supporters want to impose on it. Harry's defenders see a damaged young man who escaped a cold and uncaring family and a hostile press that had already killed his mother, and there is real truth in that. Charles' defenders see a father who did his imperfect best, who extended his hand again and again, and who has had his private failings as a parent broadcast to the world by a son determined to be heard, and there is real truth in that too. Both can be true at once. A father can love a child and still fail him. A son can be genuinely wounded and still tell a one-sided version of wounding. The estrangement between Charles and Harry is not a story with a villain. It is a story with two people who hurt each other inside an institution and a press culture that magnified every injury into a headline, and who have not yet found their way back. The contrast with William is instructive, and it completes the picture. Where Harry left, William stayed, and the relationship between Charles and his elder son appears, by every available account, to be close, trusting, and aligned. They share the burden of the institution. They share increasingly a vision of a slimmed-down, more modern monarchy. And when Charles fell ill, it was William who stepped forward, shouldering the extra duties, while his father and his wife both fought cancer in the same dreadful year. The two sons, raised by the same father in the same family, took opposite paths in adulthood, one into the heart of the institution and one out of it entirely. And the divergence says as much about the impossible position of the modern royal family as it does about Charles himself. The same father, the same upbringing, the same trauma, and two utterly different outcomes. What, then, is the verdict on Charles the father? It is, like everything else about him, mixed and resistant to a clean summary. He was on the evidence, a more loving and present father than his own father had been, a man who consciously tried to break the cold pattern he had inherited, and who succeeded at least well enough to raise an heir who loves and stands beside him. He was also, on his younger son's account, a man whose love came wrapped in constraint, who could not always give what was needed, and who at certain moments chose the institution over the child. Both of these are probably true. He was a good enough father to one son and a not good enough father to the other, and the difference may lie as much in the different needs and temperaments of the two boys, and in the cruel accident of which one was born to be king, as in anything Charles did or failed to do. He tried. He failed in places. He loved imperfectly and was loved imperfectly in return. It is, when you strip away the crowns and the headlines, one of the most ordinary stories there is. The story of a father and his children doing their flawed best across a distance none of them fully chose. The only difference is that Charles had to live it in front of the entire world, with every failure preserved on film and every wound printed in a book that sold millions. Having looked at the husband, the philanthropist, the king, and now the father, we are nearly ready to attempt the thing this whole film has been building toward, which is a fair final accounting of the man. But before we can weigh him honestly, there is one more dimension to consider, the one the public almost never sees and rarely credits: the inner life of Charles, the beliefs, the convictions, the private intellectual world of a man who has spent his entire existence being told what to think about everything except the things he actually thinks about. That is where we go next. There is a Charles the public has spent 50 years laughing at, and he is worth taking seriously at last, because the joke has not aged well, and the man it was made about turned out, on subject after subject, to have been right. The mockery began in earnest in the 1980s, and it crystallized around a single embarrassing admission. In a television interview, Charles confessed that he talked to his plants. He believed, he said, that they responded to it, that a kind word and attention helped them grow. The country howled. It was the perfect image of a dotty, privileged, out-of-touch prince, a man with nothing better to do than murmur encouragement to the shrubbery while ordinary people got on with real life. The plant-talking prince became shorthand for everything absurd about him, and underneath the joke was a more serious charge that Charles was an intellectual lightweight, a crank with too much time and too few qualifications, indulging in fashionable nonsense because no one could tell the heir to the throne to be quiet. The charge was unfair then, and it looks worse with every passing year, because the substance beneath the eccentricity was almost always sound, and very often decades ahead of its time. Take the environment, the cause that has defined his entire public life. Charles was warning about pollution, about the destruction of rainforests, about the dangers of industrial farming and chemical agriculture, in speeches delivered in the early 1970s, when he was barely into his 20s and when almost no one in public life was talking about any of it. He was an organic farmer, before organic was a word the supermarkets used, turning his estate at Highgrove into a working model of sustainable agriculture, when the agricultural establishment regarded such methods as a sentimental step backward. He launched an organic food brand, Duchy Originals, whose profits went to his charities, and which helped make organic produce a mainstream presence on British shelves. He spoke about climate change, in language of real urgency, long before it became the defining issue it is today. For decades this earned him ridicule. He was the prince who feared modern life, who romanticized the past, who could not accept progress, and then, slowly, the world caught up with him. The concerns for which he had been mocked as a crank in 1975 were, by 2025, the central anxieties of the entire planet, taught in schools, debated at the highest levels of every government, accepted as scientific fact. The plant-talking eccentric had been, on the largest question of the age, simply correct, and ahead of nearly everyone. It is one of the stranger vindications in modern public life, and it has never quite been given its due, because admitting Charles was right about the environment would mean admitting. The joke was always on the people making it. Architecture was the same story in a different key. In 1984, Charles delivered a speech to the Royal Institute of British Architects that detonated a war he is still fighting. He attacked a proposed modern extension to the National Gallery in London, calling it, in a phrase that became instantly famous, a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend. The architectural establishment was apoplectic. Here was an unelected prince, with no training and no standing, using his platform to torpedo a serious building by serious architects, to impose his nostalgic and reactionary taste on the public realm. He was cast as a Philistine and a meddler, a man who wanted to drag British building back into a sentimental imitation of the past. But Charles was making an argument, not just a complaint, and the argument was more thoughtful than his critics allowed. He believed that modern architecture, in its purest functional form, had forgotten the human beings who had to live inside it, that it built for theory rather than for people, that it ignored beauty, tradition, scale, and the simple human need for places that feel like home. To prove the point, he did something no royal critic had ever done. He built a town. Poundbury, an experimental urban development on Duchy of Cornwall land in Dorset, was designed from the ground up according to his principles. Traditional in style, walkable, mixed in its uses, built to a human scale. It was derided for years as a twee fantasy, a feudal theme park. And then people moved in and liked it, and it worked. And the planning ideas embedded in it, walkability, mixed-use development, human scale over car dependence became, over the following decades, mainstream principles of good urban design. Once again, the meddling prince had been ahead of the curve, and once again it took the world 20 years to notice. Interfaith understanding was a third cause, and a braver one than it sounds. As heir, Charles would one day become supreme governor of the Church of England, the established Protestant church of the realm, and yet he spoke, repeatedly and sincerely, of his desire to be a defender of faith in general, rather than merely the defender of the Protestant faith, a bridge between religions in an increasingly diverse and divided country. He studied Islam, learned about its traditions, spoke warmly of what the great faiths held in common. In a Britain that was becoming more multicultural by the year, and in a world increasingly fractured along religious lines, it was a generous and far-sighted instinct, and it too drew suspicion, from traditionalists who thought a future head of the Church of England had no business cozying up to other religions, and from cynics who saw it as woolly and naive, but the instinct behind it was sound, and it reflected a genuine intellectual curiosity about belief and meaning that set him apart from almost everyone in his position. So the picture that emerges, when you actually examine what Charles thought, rather than how he was mocked for thinking it, is not of a lightweight at all. It is of a serious, curious, independent-minded man, genuinely engaged with difficult questions, often unfashionable, frequently ahead of his time, and willing to endure decades of ridicule for convictions he refused to abandon. The Cambridge degree was not an ornament. The man read and thought and cared about a great many things, and he was right about more of them than his detractors have ever been comfortable admitting. But here is where the same quality that makes him admirable also made him genuinely problematic, and an honest film cannot skip past it because it is the most serious constitutional question his entire character raises. The British monarch is supposed to be politically neutral. The whole modern settlement, the reason the monarchy survives at all, rests on the understanding that the sovereign reigns but does not rule, that the king has views on nothing that matters, that he is above politics precisely because he stays silent on it. His mother perfected this discipline to an almost superhuman degree. In 70 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth gave away virtually nothing of what she actually thought about any political question. It was the secret of her success and the foundation of her authority. Charles was constitutionally different in both senses of the word. He had spent 40 years as Prince of Wales not staying silent, but speaking out, campaigning, advocating, pressing his convictions on the public and, more controversially, on the government. And the most striking evidence of how far he was willing to push came to light in a long legal battle over a set of letters that became known as the Black Spider Memos, so called because of Charles's dense, spidery handwriting. These were private letters Charles had written to government ministers over the years, lobbying them on the causes he cared about: agriculture, the environment, architecture, the armed forces, and a range of other policy matters. The government fought for years to keep them secret, precisely because their publication would reveal an heir to the throne actively attempting to influence elected ministers, in violation of the spirit of royal neutrality. When the courts finally forced their release in 2015, the contents were less explosive than some had hoped, more the earnest hobby horses of a passionate prince than any sinister attempt to subvert democracy. But the principle they exposed was real and troubling. Here was a future king who did not accept that his role required silence, who believed his convictions were too important to keep to himself, and who used his unique access to ministers to press them. The defenders said he was simply doing what any concerned citizen might, raising issues with those in power, and that his causes were benign. The critics said that was exactly the problem, that an unelected hereditary monarch has no business lobbying elected ministers on anything, however benign, because the moment he does, the neutrality that justifies his entire existence collapses. And the critics had the stronger constitutional argument. A king who lobbies is a king with opinions, and a king with opinions is, sooner or later, a king who can be opposed, and a monarchy that can be opposed on policy has lost the one thing that keeps it safe, which is its position above the fray. This was the genuine danger Charles carried to the throne. Not that he was an empty figurehead, but the opposite, that he was a man of strong, sincere, hard-won convictions who had spent 4 decades expressing them, and who would now have to fall silent, completely and permanently, in the role he had waited his whole life to fill. Could he do it? Could the most opinionated heir in modern history transform overnight into the silent and neutral sovereign the Constitution required? Many doubted it. Some predicted he would be unable to help himself, that the meddling prince would become the meddling king and drag the monarchy into political controversy that would imperil its survival. The evidence of his reign so far suggests he understood the problem better than his critics feared. On becoming king, Charles signalled clearly that he understood the rules had changed, that the campaigning was over, that the convictions would now have to be held privately and expressed, if at all, only within the strict limits the role allowed. He had said as much before his accession, acknowledging that he was not so foolish as to imagine he could carry on as king exactly as he had as prince, that he understood the difference between the two roles, and in practice he has largely honoured it, channeling his environmental passion into the ceremonial register a king is permitted, hosting and convening rather than lobbying and demanding. The discipline that was forged in the cold halls of Gordonstoun, the lifelong habit of controlling himself and keeping his real feelings off his face, turned out, in the end, to be exactly the training the throne required. The very self-suppression that had made him seem cold as a young man became, as king, a constitutional virtue, there is a quiet poignancy in that. For most of his life, Charles's control over his own convictions and feelings was read as a defect, a coldness, an inability to be fully human in public. And then he reached the role he was born for, and discovered that this same control was the precise quality the role demanded, that the throne required him to suppress the very passions that had defined him, to become, in his 8th decade, the silent and neutral figure his mother had always been. The man finally fit the job, but only by hiding the part of himself that was most alive. The plant-talking, building-hating, minister-lobbying prince had to be locked away so that the king could reign. Whether that is a triumph of duty or a small tragedy of self-erasure depends, like everything else about him, on how you choose to look at it. We have now seen nearly all of him. The frightened boy who learned to hide, the hesitant lover who lost and regained the woman he wanted, the husband who failed a princess the world adored, the philanthropist who did vast good and accepted questionable money, the king who came to the throne old and ill, the father who loved imperfectly, the thinker who was right more often than he was credited, and who had to silence himself to reign. All of it is on the record, all of it is real, and all of it has to be weighed against itself and against the legend to arrive at anything like a fair final judgment. That reckoning is what remains. In the final part of this story, we will try to answer the question we began with: whether the real Charles, the man behind the palace doors, was the cold and controlling figure of the legend, or someone the legend was never quite able to see. We began with 4 words, whatever in love means, and we began with a question those words were taken to answer, the question of whether Charles was, at his core, a cold man, a man who could not love, a man who failed the woman the world adored, who waited a lifetime for a crown out of ambition, who hid behind palace doors a self that was distant, controlling, and incapable of warmth. That is the legend. It has been the dominant story of his life for more than 40 years, and now, having walked through the documented record of that life, from the cradle to the throne, we are finally in a position to test it against the evidence and to deliver something like a fair verdict. The honest conclusion is that the legend is not so much false as lazy. It took the most visible feature of the man, his reserve, and mistook it for the whole of him. It saw a surface and assumed there was nothing underneath. And the deeper you go into the actual record, the more the Cold Prince story falls apart, not because Charles was a warm and easy man, he plainly was not, but because coldness is precisely the wrong word for what the evidence shows. Consider what we have seen. A man supposedly incapable of love who pursued one woman for more than 30 years, lost her to his own hesitation, absorbed a nation's hatred to win her back, and married her at last in the teeth of every objection. That is not the behavior of a cold man. It is the behavior of a man whose attachments ran so deep and so stubborn that he sacrificed his own reputation rather than abandon them. A genuinely cold man would have dropped Camilla the moment she became a liability. Charles spent a decade rehabilitating her instead. Whatever you call that, you cannot honestly call it an absence of feeling. Consider the confession. A cold and calculating man, asked on television whether he had been unfaithful, gives the smooth deflection and protects himself. Charles told the truth, knowing it would damage him, because something in him could not bring itself to lie when asked directly to his face. He did the same at his engagement, refusing to perform a certainty about love that he did not feel. He did the same with his cancer, surrendering his most private medical news to the public in the hope it might help strangers. Again and again, across 50 years, the pattern holds. Charles was not a man who felt too little. He was a man who felt a great deal and could not always hide it, and whose rare moments of honesty were so awkward, so badly timed, so against his own interest, that the world mistook them for the opposite of what they were. The reserve was real, but the reserve was not coldness. The reserve was a wall, built in childhood, in a cold school by a cold sea, by a frightened and watched little boy who learned that the only safe thing to do with his feelings was to bury them. The tragedy of Charles, if it is a tragedy, is that the wall worked too well. He built it to survive, and it did let him survive, and then it became the only thing most people could see, and they spent the rest of his life judging the wall and never asking what it was protecting. None of which means he is owed a hero's verdict, because the failures are real too, and an honest reckoning does not airbrush them. He did fail Diana, Whatever the truth of the timelines, whatever the disputes over who betrayed whom and when, the plain fact is that a vulnerable 19-year-old married a man whose heart was at least partly elsewhere, and she suffered terribly inside that marriage, and she died young and unhappy and afraid, and Charles was a central cause of that suffering. The kinder readings of his conduct do not erase her pain. He may have been trapped in a marriage he should never have entered, pushed into it by an institution and a press that demanded he settle down. But he was a grown man of 32, and she was a teenager of 19, and the power between them was never equal, and he knew on some level, even at the engagement, that the foundation was cracked, that he allowed it to proceed anyway, and that she paid the heaviest price for it, is a genuine moral weight that no amount of context fully lifts. He was careless with money and with the company his charity kept. The good he did through the Prince's Trust and his other causes was vast and real. But he accepted bags of cash from a foreign politician, took money connected to deeply tainted names, and presided over an organization where his closest aide was credibly accused of selling honors, all while maintaining that he knew nothing. Perhaps he genuinely did not know. But a man is responsible for the people he chooses to trust, and Charles chose for 40 years to depend on a fixer who eventually fell in disgrace, and that says something about a willingness not to look too closely at the things he would rather not see. And he failed, at least partly, as a father to his younger son, however hard he tried, however much love was there, however one-sided Harry's account may be. A wound that public, that lasting, that unhealed, does not open over nothing. Charles extended his hand repeatedly, and that is to his credit. But the estrangement is real, and the grandchildren he barely knows are growing up an ocean away, and the time he has left to fix it is running short, and that is a sorrow he carries that is at least in part of his own making. So the verdict is not a clean acquittal, and it is not meant to be. The fair verdict on Charles is the one the easy legend never had the patience for, which is that he was a deeply human mixture of genuine virtue and genuine failure, and that the single word cold describes almost none of it accurately. He was loyal to the point of stubbornness, and honest to the point of self-harm. He was diligent, curious, and far-sighted, right about the environment and architecture and a dozen other things decades before the world agreed. He was also hesitant when he should have been decisive, careless when he should have been careful, and constrained, in the end, in exactly the ways his cold critics described, but for reasons far more human and far sadder than mere coldness could ever explain. What of his reign and his legacy? It is, by definition, unfinished, and it began under the shadow of illness, and it may not be long. He came to the throne at 73, the oldest monarch in the history of the institution, and within a year he was fighting cancer, and the time available to him to leave his own mark is measured in years, not decades. He will never have his mother's reign. He could not. He came too late, and the world had changed too much, and the institution he inherited was already smaller in the public imagination than the one she had held. In that sense, his kingship was always going to be a bridge rather than an era, a passage between the long certainty of Elizabeth and the eventual reign of William, and he seems, by every sign, to understand and accept that. He is doing the job he was born for, dutifully in his 8th decade, with the diseased clock ticking, channeling the passions of a life into the narrow ceremonial space a king is permitted, having locked away the campaigning prince so that the neutral sovereign could reign. There is something quietly moving in the shape of it when you stand back far enough to see the whole. A boy is told in the cradle that his entire life belongs to a role he will not assume for 73 years. He spends those 73 years preparing, enduring, being underestimated, being mocked, failing and grieving and waiting, and building in the long empty interval a body of work to justify a life that was never his to direct. And then finally, an old man, he receives the thing he was promised, and it arrives wrapped in his mother's death and shadowed almost at once by his own mortality. And the role he has waited his whole life for requires him to silence the very self he spent that life developing. He fits the throne at last, but only by disappearing into it. The man becomes the king, and in becoming the king, the man, the real and feeling and stubborn and curious man, has to step quietly out of view. Whatever in love means, he said it at the threshold of a marriage that would define and damage him, and the world has laughed at it and condemned it for 40 years as the confession of a man who did not know how to feel. But by now, perhaps, you can hear it differently. Here was a man who had already loved and lost, who had been taught from boyhood to distrust every easy declaration, who could not bring himself to perform a feeling he was not certain he could honor. The 4 words were not the proof that he felt nothing. They were, if you listen closely, the opposite. They were the words of a man who took love so seriously that he would not pretend to it, standing beside a young woman who deserved someone who could say yes without hesitation, knowing even then, in some buried and inarticulate place, that he was not that man, and that the fairy tale the whole world was demanding of him was already quietly a lie. He was not cold, he was guarded, and he was constrained, and he was often wrong, and he caused real pain, and he also did real good and loved real people with a stubborn constancy that cost him dearly. He was, in the end, exactly what the evidence shows and the legend could never see. Not a villain and not a saint. A difficult, dutiful, deeply private man, shaped by a childhood that taught him to hide, handed a destiny he never chose, doing his flawed and human best inside a role that allowed him almost no room to be anything but a symbol. The crown sat on his head at last, and the man beneath it remained, as he had always been, mostly hidden, mostly misunderstood, and far more human than the world ever gave him credit for. That is the real Charles, as far as the record can show him. Not the cartoon of the cold prince, and not the polished myth of the dutiful king, but the difficult truth in between, which is the only kind of truth that ever turns out to be real. If this is the kind of history you want, the kind that goes past the headline and the legend and into the actual record, and that takes a human being seriously enough to judge him fairly rather than easily, then subscribe, because there are many more lives waiting to be told this way, and every one of them is stranger and sadder and more human than the story the world first agreed to believe. Of all the things Charles achieved across his long life, the strangest and least likely was this. He took the most hated woman in Britain and, over the better part of 2 decades, made her a queen, not by decree, not by force, but by patience so relentless and so disciplined that the nation came around without ever quite deciding to. It is, on its own terms, one of the most remarkable feats of public persuasion in modern royal history, and it tells you more about the real character of Charles than almost anything else he ever did. To understand the scale of it, you have to remember how low Camilla had fallen. In the years after the Camillagate tape and Diana's death, she was not merely unpopular. She was reviled. In the eyes of millions, she was the woman who had wrecked the marriage of the people's princess, the third person in the crowded marriage, the mistress whose existence had poisoned a fairy tale. She was jeered in the street. By one widely repeated account, she had bread rolls thrown at her in a supermarket. The tabloids treated her as a national villain. There was a stretch of years in the late 1990s when the idea that this woman might one day stand beside Charles as his crowned consort would have seemed not just unlikely but genuinely absurd, an insult the British public would never tolerate. Polls showed deep and durable hostility. If Charles had wanted to protect his own path to the throne, the obvious move, the move every cynical advisor would have recommended, was to keep Camilla firmly out of sight and let the public forget she existed. He refused, and the refusal is the point. What followed was a campaign of extraordinary patience, managed in part by his communications team, but driven, at its core, by Charles's own absolute refusal to give her up. The strategy was never to demand acceptance. It was to make Camilla so gradually and so quietly visible that the public's hostility had nothing dramatic to react against, and could only, over time, slowly cool. She appeared first at the very edges of his life, never center stage, never presented as a fait accompli. Then, in a moment of careful choreography in early 1999, Charles and Camilla left a London hotel together after a birthday party, allowing the assembled photographers their first sanctioned image of the couple in public. There was no statement, no defiance, no demand that anyone approve. There was simply a photograph, and then the world was allowed to absorb it and move on and grow used to it. That set the rhythm for everything that came after. Step by tiny step, Camilla was woven into public life, an appearance here, an engagement there, a gradual normalization so slow it was almost imperceptible from one month to the next, but undeniable across years. Each small advance was calculated to let the public's anger lose one more degree of heat, and it required, from Charles, a discipline that his critics never credited him with possessing. He had to absorb years of continued hostility toward the woman he loved, read the cruel headlines, watch the polls, and never once lose patience, never force the issue, never demand that the country hurry up and forgive her. The same self-control that had been forged in the cold halls of Gordonstoun, the lifelong habit of suppressing his own urgency and presenting a calm surface, turned out to be exactly the tool the campaign required. The boy who had learned to wait now waited, on Camilla's behalf, for as long as it took. It took until 2005. On the 9th of April that year, Charles and Camilla were married in a civil ceremony at Windsor, followed by a service of blessing led by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was, by royal standards, a modest affair, and it had to navigate genuine complications. Both parties were divorced, and Camilla's first husband was still living, which raised real theological difficulty for a man who would one day be Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Some senior figures in the church voiced their unease. There were even calls, from certain quarters, for Charles to apologize for the adultery before the wedding could be blessed. The ceremony was civil rather than religious, precisely to thread these needles, and even the Queen, Charles's mother, did not attend the civil ceremony itself, though she came to the blessing and the reception afterward, a small detail that captured the lingering awkwardness around the whole event. But it happened. The woman he had loved since before Diana, since before any of it began, was finally publicly, permanently his wife, and in a gesture that revealed the political sensitivity that still surrounded her, Camilla chose not to use the title Princess of Wales, the title that would technically have been hers, out of deference to the memory of the woman who had held it and whom the public still mourned. She became the Duchess of Cornwall instead. It was a calculated humility, an acknowledgement that the ghost of Diana still hung over everything, and that the campaign to win the public was far from finished, even with the marriage secured. And so the second phase of the campaign began, the long work of turning the tolerated wife into a genuinely respected public figure. Here Camilla did much of the work herself, and she did it well. She was, by temperament, the opposite of Diana, and rather than compete with a memory she could never defeat, she offered the public something different. Where Diana had been luminous, vulnerable and tragic, Camilla was steady, down-to-earth, humorous, and entirely without pretension. She took up causes that suited her, campaigning against domestic violence and for literacy, working quietly and without drama. She did not seek the spotlight. She did not try to be loved in the way Diana had been loved, which would have been impossible and would have backfired completely. She simply did the work, year after year, and let the public slowly revise its opinion of her on the evidence of her conduct rather than the memory of her past. It worked, as Charles's long patience had worked, by accumulation rather than by any single dramatic stroke. The woman who had once been pelted with bread rolls became, over 20 years, a familiar and then a trusted and finally an affectionately regarded figure. The polls turned. The hostility faded into acceptance and then into something close to warmth. By the time of Charles's accession, the question of whether Camilla should be queen, which had once seemed unthinkable, had largely answered itself. Queen Elizabeth, in a significant gesture in 2022, publicly expressed her own sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when the time came, a deliberate act of legitimization from the most respected woman in the country, designed to smooth the path that Charles had spent his whole adult life clearing. And so, on the 6th of May 2023, at Westminster Abbey, Camilla was crowned queen alongside her husband. The most hated woman in Britain, the third person in the crowded marriage, the mistress the nation had blamed for everything, was anointed and crowned in the most sacred ceremony the country possesses, and the public, by and large, accepted it without protest. The transformation was complete. It had taken more than 30 years from the beginning of their relationship, 2 marriages, a national tragedy, a humiliating tape, a decade of public loathing, and the most disciplined campaign of rehabilitation in modern royal memory. But Charles had done what he set out to do. He had not only kept the woman he loved, he had made the nation accept her on the throne beside him. Step back and consider what that achievement reveals, because it reframes the whole legend of the Cold Prince. A man genuinely incapable of love does not do this. He does not spend 3 decades and his entire reputation and an ocean of public hostility on the rehabilitation of one woman. The cold man cuts his losses. The calculating man chooses the throne over the mistress. Charles chose both, refused to surrender either, and through sheer stubborn patience eventually got both. Whatever else the campaign for Camilla proves, it proves that the central charge against him, that he could not love, that he was hollow at the core, was simply wrong. He could love. He loved with a stubbornness that bordered on obsession, with a constancy that outlasted national hatred, with a patience that took 30 years to reach its goal. The tragedy of Diana was, in part, that this same capacity for deep and stubborn love had been fixed, from the very beginning, on someone other than the wife the world had chosen for him. The story of Charles and Camilla is not a comfortable love story. It came at the cost of another woman's happiness, and the public has always believed, contributed to her death. There is no version of it that does not carry that weight, but it is unmistakably a love story, and a deep one, and its existence demolishes the idea of a man without a heart. He had a heart. The difficulty for everyone caught in his orbit was that it had been given, irrevocably, before the cameras ever started watching, to a woman the world was not prepared to accept, and that Charles, in his guarded and stubborn way, was never once prepared to take it back. That settles the question of whether Charles could love. The harder question, the one that will define whatever remains of his reign, is what becomes of the institution he gave his whole life to, and whether the monarchy he has handed toward his son can survive a century that has far less use for kings than the one Charles was born into. That is where we turn for the final time. Charles came to the throne as the head of an institution that no longer commanded the unquestioned devotion it had enjoyed for almost the whole of his mother's reign, and he knew it. The monarchy he inherited in 2022 was not the monarchy he had been born into in 1948, and the difference is the key to understanding both the limits of his reign and the anxious, careful way he has chosen to conduct it. When Charles was a small boy, the British monarchy sat at the centre of national life as an almost sacred fixture, its authority rooted in deference, religion, empire, and a popular reverence that very few questioned out loud. His mother's coronation in 1953 was watched as a moment of genuine national communion, the young queen anointed before God as the embodiment of the nation itself. For 70 years, through the steady discipline of her reign, Elizabeth held that reverence largely intact, even as the world around it transformed beyond recognition. The empire dissolved, religion receded, deference, that great invisible support of the old order, drained away across the decades, and yet the Queen herself remained, by sheer longevity and unwavering consistency, a fixed point that most of the country continued to respect, often less out of belief in the institution than out of affection for the woman. When she died, that personal magic died with her, and Charles inherited the institution stripped of the one thing that had been holding much of its popularity in place. He came to the throne as a known and divisive figure, carrying the baggage of Diana and Camilla and the charity scandals and the meddling prince, at the head of a monarchy whose support, particularly among the young, was softer and more conditional than it had been in living memory. Polls in the years around his accession showed a clear generational divide, with older Britons still broadly supportive and younger ones increasingly indifferent or openly hostile to the whole idea of a hereditary head of state. Republican sentiment, long a marginal position confined to a small and easily ignored fringe, had grown into something a serious king could no longer simply wave away. At his own coronation, anti-monarchy protesters gathered in central London, and a number were arrested, a sight that would have been almost unimaginable at his mother's crowning 70 years before. The crown Charles had waited his whole life to wear was, by the time it reached him, lighter in the national imagination than it had ever been. He understood the danger, and his response to it has defined the texture of his reign. Charles did not come to the throne and attempt to restore the old grandeur, to reassert the sacred authority of a vanished age. He came to the throne, instead, as a man trying to make the institution smaller, leaner, and more defensible, to trim it to a size the modern country might still tolerate. He had long believed in a slimmed-down monarchy, a smaller core of working royals, doing genuine public work rather than a sprawling cast of minor relations living at public expense. His coronation reflected the same instinct. It was deliberately more modest than his mother's, shorter, less extravagant, with a trimmed guest list and a conscious effort to acknowledge the multi-faith, multi-ethnic country Britain had become. It was a coronation that seemed almost anxious about its own relevance, trying to honour 1,000 years of tradition while quietly apologising for the cost and the grandeur of it, unsure whether the country was still watching with devotion or merely with curiosity. This is the central irony of his accession, and it is worth stating plainly because it gives his whole late life its peculiar shape. Charles spent more than 7 decades preparing to be king. He studied the role, shadowed his mother, formed his convictions, endured every humiliation of the long wait, all in service of a moment that, when it finally came, found the very throne he was inheriting diminished and uncertain of its own future. He had trained his entire life to lead an institution that, by the time he reached its head, was no longer sure it wanted to be led or to exist at all. Few human beings have ever fulfilled a lifelong ambition under such melancholy circumstances, achieving the thing they were promised in the cradle, only to find it worth less, in the world's eyes, than it had been when the promise was made. And yet there is a case, a real one, that Charles is precisely the king this diminished moment requires, and that his apparent disadvantages are, in this particular passage of history, strengths. A young and glamorous monarch might have tried to reassert a grandeur the country no longer wants. Charles, old and dutiful and chastened by a lifetime of public failure, makes no such claim. He asks for little. He performs the role with a kind of weary, conscientious modesty that suits an age suspicious of pomp, and his deepest convictions, the environmental passion for which he was mocked for 50 years, happen to align almost perfectly with the anxieties of the younger generations, most sceptical of the monarchy itself. The plant-talking prince turns out to share the central concern of the very people most likely to want him abolished, and that is not nothing. It gives the institution, in his person, a thread of genuine relevance it might otherwise lack. But Charles knows, better than anyone, that his reign is not the point. He is a bridge, and he appears to have made his peace with being a bridge. He came too late, and the world had changed too much for his reign to be an era in its own right. Its real purpose is to carry the institution safely across the dangerous gap between the 70-year certainty of Elizabeth and the eventual reign of his elder son, and to hand to William a monarchy that is still standing, still functioning, and still, just about, accepted. Everything in the way Charles conducts himself, the modesty, the discipline, the careful avoidance of the political controversy his critics always feared, points to a man managing a careful transition rather than building a monument to himself. The future, then, rests on William, and here Charles's legacy as both king and father converges. The relationship between Charles and his elder son is, by every available account, close, trusting and aligned, founded on a shared understanding of what the institution needs to survive. Where Harry left, William stayed, and the two of them, father and heir, have increasingly functioned as partners in the same project, the careful modernization and slimming of a monarchy under pressure. When Charles fell ill in 2024, it was William who stepped forward to carry the additional weight, shouldering the duties his father could not, while also caring for a wife fighting cancer of her own. The image of the heir steadily taking on more of the burden, prepared and willing, is exactly the image of a smooth succession that the institution most needs to project, and it is, in large part, the product of the kind of father Charles managed to be to at least one of his sons. So the monarchy that Charles will eventually hand to William is a diminished thing compared to the one he was born into, but it is intact, and it is in the hands of a prepared and broadly popular heir, married to a woman the public admires, raising the children who represent the institution's future. Whether that is enough to carry the crown through a century that may finally have outgrown the very idea of inherited royalty is a question no one can answer, and that Charles himself will not live to see resolved. He has done what a bridge can do. He has kept the thing standing and steadied it and passed it on. The rest belongs to William, and to a country that has not yet decided whether it still wants a king at all. When the history of this reign is written, it will be brief, because the reign itself will likely be brief, and it will be overshadowed on one side by his mother's vast era, and on the other by whatever his son, makes of the inheritance, but it should record this much fairly. Charles came to the throne, old, ill, and underestimated, at the head of an institution that many had written off, including many who had written off Charles himself. And he met that diminished moment with the only qualities he had ever really possessed in abundance: patience, duty, the discipline to suppress himself in service of something larger, the willingness to do the unglamorous work without expectation of reward or applause. They were the qualities of the long-waiting heir, forged across 46 years of preparation, and they turned out to be the exact qualities a threatened and uncertain crown most needed in the man chosen to carry it through its hardest passage. In generations, he was never going to be a great king in the way his mother was a great queen. He came too late, and the world had changed too much, and he carried too much history to ever command that kind of reverence. But he may yet prove to have been the right king for a moment that needed not grandeur but humility, not a monument but a bridge, not a man who demanded the country's devotion, but one who quietly asked only to be allowed to do his duty for whatever time he had left. That is the whole of him, as far as the record can show. The frightened boy who learned to hide, the hesitant lover who lost and regained the woman of his life, the husband who failed a princess the world adored, the philanthropist who did great good and accepted questionable money, the thinker who was right before the world was ready, the father who loved imperfectly, the old man who received his crown wrapped in grief and shadowed by illness, and who wore it, in the end, not as a triumph but as a final and lifelong act of duty. Whatever in love means, he said it at the beginning, and the world spent 40 years deciding it knew exactly what those 4 words revealed. By now, perhaps, you understand them better than the reporter who first heard them. Not the words of a man who could not love, but the words of a man who took love and duty and truth too seriously ever to pretend. That was always the real Charles. Behind every door the public was never allowed to open. Not cold, never cold, only guarded and dutiful, and far more human than the legend was ever willing to see. If you want the rest of these lives told the same way, past the headline and the legend, and into the truth of who these people actually were, subscribe and stay with us. There are a great many more crowns, and a great many more men and women beneath them, waiting to be seen clearly at last. There is no job description for being the heir to the throne, and that absence, more than anything else, defined the middle decades of Charles's life. A king has duties laid down by 1,000 years of precedent. A Prince of Wales has nothing but a title and a weight. For 46 years, longer than any heir in the history of the British monarchy, Charles occupied a role that consisted, at its core, of not being something yet. He was the man in the antechamber, fully grown, fully capable, fully prepared, and permitted to do almost nothing with any of it, except wait for a death he could not wish for. It is worth dwelling on what that actually does to a person, because the public, fixated on the scandals and the marriage, rarely pause to consider it. Most people's lives have a shape. You train for something, you do it, you advance, you retire. There are milestones, promotions, arrivals. Charles had none of that. He reached his physical and intellectual prime in his 30s and 40s with no throne in sight, and no possibility of one for decades. His mother was healthy, devoted to her duty, and showed every sign of reigning as she did into extreme old age. The one event that would give Charles's life its purpose was the one event a decent son must dread. He was, in the most literal and inescapable sense, a man whose entire reason for existing depended on the loss of his own mother, and who had to live, year after year, decade after decade, holding that unbearable arithmetic somewhere in his mind, while smiling for the cameras and cutting the ribbons. A lesser man might have been hollowed out by it, and there were moments, particularly in the years of the failing marriage and the public humiliation, when Charles seemed close to it. The waiting bred a restlessness in him, a need to matter, to do something real, that the empty role of heir could not satisfy. And so he did something that has no real precedent among British heirs. He built the role he was denied. He took the one substantial thing the position actually gave him, the Duchy of Cornwall, and turned it into the engine of a working life. The Duchy of Cornwall is an ancient estate, established in the 14th century to provide an income for the heir to the throne. By the time it came to Charles, it was a vast portfolio of land and property across England, and it provided him with both his private income and, more importantly, a real enterprise to run. Most heirs had treated it as a source of money and little else. Charles treated it as a laboratory. He ran it actively, shaped its investments around his convictions, and used it to put his ideas into practice in the physical world. The organic farming he championed was practiced on duchy land. The town of Poundbury, his great architectural experiment, was built on duchy land in Dorset. The Duchy Originals food brand, whose profits flowed to his charities, grew out of the estate's produce. Through the duchy, Charles gave himself something the role of heir had otherwise withheld, which was a tangible body of work, results he could point to, an answer to the question of what, exactly, he had been doing with all those waiting years. Highgrove, his country house in Gloucestershire, became the personal centre of this self-made working life. He bought it in 1980, the year before his marriage, and he poured himself into its gardens with a devotion that became famous, and for a time mocked. The plant-talking joke was born here, in the great garden Charles built over decades, an organic, experimental, deeply personal creation that became one of the most admired private gardens in the country. The garden was, in a sense, the perfect expression of the man. It was patient work, the kind that rewards years of attention with results that arrive slowly and cannot be rushed. It was beautiful and unfashionable, and built according to his own stubborn convictions. And it was a place where a man with no kingdom to govern could at least make something flourish under his own hands. For a prince denied the throne for half a century, the garden at Highgrove may have been the one realm that was truly and entirely his. The relationship with his mother sat at the strange heart of all of this, and it was a relationship of profound and unresolvable complexity. Charles loved the Queen, by every account, with a deep and genuine devotion, and he respected her absolutely as sovereign. But she was also the obstacle. She was the living embodiment of the role he could not have, the person whose continued life, however much he loved her, was the thing standing between him and his purpose. There is no clean way to hold those two truths at once. Love and the unspeakable wish that lurks beneath the love, and Charles, the great suppressor of his own feelings, almost certainly never allowed himself to articulate the second even privately. The discipline that governed his whole life was nowhere more necessary than here, in the management of feelings about his own mother that no son should ever have to manage. There was also the matter of how the Queen governed, and how Charles waited to govern, because, in temperament, the two could hardly have been more different, and the difference foreshadowed the central tension of his reign. Elizabeth's genius was for silence, for the absolute withholding of opinion, for being a mirror in which the nation could see whatever it needed to see. Charles was the opposite, a man bursting with convictions he could not stop expressing. As he waited through the decades, he watched his mother practice a discipline of self-erasure that he knew, on some level, he would one day be required to adopt, and that he was temperamentally least suited to of any heir in living memory. The long apprenticeship was, among other things, a slow and incomplete education in becoming the kind of king his mother was, an education Charles resisted for most of his life and only fully submitted to when the crown finally arrived and left him no choice. The waiting also gave Charles something his critics rarely credited, which was time. Time to read, to think, to develop genuine expertise in the subjects that moved him, to build relationships across decades, to watch the world change, and to refine his own understanding of it. The very length of his apprenticeship, so often treated as a kind of tragic joke, the eternal prince who would never be king, also made him almost certainly the best prepared monarch in the history of the institution. No one had ever come to the throne, having shadowed a reigning sovereign for 7 decades, having run a major estate for half a century, having founded and led charities, having formed and tested his convictions over a working lifetime. When the crown finally came, whatever else could be said about Charles, no one could say he was unready. He had been ready for 40 years. He had simply not been allowed to begin. That is the quiet dignity buried inside the long wait, and it deserves to be named. A man was handed, through no choice of his own, a role that consisted mostly of waiting and being underestimated, a role with no clear purpose and no foreseeable end, a role that required him to hold an unbearable truth about his own mother in silence for decades. And rather than collapse into idleness or bitterness, he built himself a working life out of the scraps the position gave him, made something flourish at Highgrove, put his convictions into practice on duchy land, and prepared himself with a thoroughness no heir had ever matched, for a job he had every reason to fear might never come. There is a kind of heroism in that, unglamorous and easily overlooked. The heroism of the man who does the work anyway, in the long dark, with no guarantee of reward. He was the apprentice who served the longest apprenticeship in the trade's history, and who was mocked throughout for the very fact of his apprenticeship. And then at 73, the master finally departed, and the apprentice picked up the tools he had spent a lifetime learning to use, knowing he would have only a little time to use them. What he had learned in the long wait was patience and duty, and the discipline of doing the work without applause. They were exactly the things the diminished crown would need. The wait, in the end, had not been wasted. It had made him. No human being in modern history has been more photographed, more written about, more watched, or more comprehensively defined by the press than the British royal family, and Charles spent his entire life inside that machine. To understand him, and to understand why the legend of the Cold Prince took such deep and lasting hold, you have to understand the strange and brutal relationship between Charles and the media that both made him and unmade him, often in the same breath. The press built the fairy tale, and the press destroyed it, and the people inside the story were never fully in control of either. When Charles married Diana in 1981, the media presented it to the world as a romance for the ages, a storybook wedding, a prince and his beautiful young bride. The narrative was simple, irresistible, and largely a fiction, but it was the fiction the public wanted, and the press was happy to supply. And the same machine that built that fairy tale spent the following 15 years dismantling it, photograph by photograph, headline by headline, until the romance had been replaced by a war, and the war by a tragedy. The press did not merely report on the marriage of Charles and Diana. It shaped it, pressured it, fed on it, and arguably helped to kill it, because both Charles and Diana, trapped in a failing marriage, under relentless scrutiny, learned to fight their private battle through the very newspapers that were profiting from their pain. Diana understood the media in a way Charles never did, and that asymmetry shaped the entire public memory of their marriage. She was a natural at it, instinctively brilliant at the image, the gesture, the photograph that told a story. She knew how to use the cameras to communicate directly with the public over the heads of the palace, and she did it with devastating effect, most famously in the Panorama interview that buried Charles's reputation for a generation. Charles, by contrast, was hopeless at it. He was stiff where she was fluid, guarded where she was open, awkward in exactly the moments she was luminous. In the great public contest between them, conducted through the media, it was never a fair fight, because one of them was a genius of image, and the other was a man who had been trained since boyhood to give nothing away, which on camera reads as exactly the coldness the legend accused him of. This is, in large part, how the Cold Prince narrative was manufactured. It was not invented from nothing. It was built from 1,000 photographs of a reserved man standing beside a radiant woman, 1,000 contrasts between her warmth and his formality, 1,000 moments in which the camera, which loves emotion and punishes restraint, made Diana look like the heart of the family, and Charles look like the cold institution she was trapped inside. The narrative was not exactly false, but it was the product of a medium that systematically favored one of them over the other, that rewarded Diana's gifts and exposed Charles's limitations, and that turned a complicated, private reality into a simple public story with a heroine and a villain. The press did not lie about Charles. It did something subtler and more powerful. It told a true story about his reserve in a way that made the reserve mean something it did not actually mean. And then came the Bashir revelation, decades later, which exposed just how deep the manipulation could run. The single most damaging document in the entire case against Charles, Diana's Panorama interview with its unforgettable line about the crowded marriage, turned out to have been obtained by deception. The investigation led by Lord Dyson established that the journalist Martin Bashir had used forged bank statements to win the trust of Diana's brother and through him to secure the interview that did Charles such lasting harm. The interview reflected Diana's genuine feelings, and nothing about the deception makes Charles's admitted infidelity less real. But it means that the most powerful single blow ever struck against him in the court of public opinion was In its origins, the product of journalist dishonesty, broadcast by a trusted institution and absorbed by the entire nation as truth. Prince William, in a rare and pointed public statement, decades later, said the interview should never have happened and had contributed to his mother's fear and isolation in her final years. The mirror that the press held up to Charles, it turned out, had been deliberately and criminally distorted, and the distortion had shaped how a generation saw him. The royal family's own response to the media wars, over the years, evolved into a kind of grim defensive philosophy, and one phrase came to capture it perfectly. When the family found itself accused, in a later interview, of things it disputed, the palace issued a statement of extraordinary economy and restraint, observing that recollections may vary. 3 words: no counterattack, no detailed rebuttal, no descent into the public mudslinging that the press was always hoping to provoke. Just the quiet, almost wishy acknowledgement that different people remember the same events differently, and that the institution would not be drawn into a fight conducted on the media's terms. It was in its way a very Charles approach to the press, even if the words were not his, the refusal to perform, the discipline of saying as little as possible, the understanding that engaging the machine on its own ground is a fight the royals can never win. Because that was the lesson Charles had learned, slowly and at enormous cost, across a lifetime in the glare. The media could not be defeated, and it could not be controlled. It could only be endured. Every attempt he made to use it actively had backfired. The Dimbleby documentary, meant to rehabilitate him, produced the confession that damaged him. The briefings against Diana during the marriage wars made him look petty and cruel. The harder he tried to manage his own image, the worse it tended to go, because he lacked Diana's instinct and the press could always smell the calculation. And so, over time, Charles retreated into the only strategy that had ever served him, the strategy of the long game, the same patience he had brought to the Camilla campaign and to the wait for the throne. He stopped trying to win the daily battle of the headlines and trusted instead that the slow accumulation of actual work, the charities, the convictions, the duty performed year after year, would eventually tell a truer story than the press could, and slowly it did. The rehabilitation of Charles's reputation across the quarter century after Diana's death was not achieved through any media masterstroke. It was achieved by outlasting the narrative, by simply continuing dutifully and unglamorously until the public's understanding of him drifted, over many years, from the cold villain of the 1990s towards something more measured and more fair. The man who could never win a news cycle won, in the end, the long argument of his own life, not by fighting the mirror but by giving it, decade after decade, a more accurate face to reflect. There is a hard truth buried in all of this, about the price of a life lived entirely in public, and it applies to Charles as much as to anyone who has ever lived. He was never allowed to be simply himself. From the moment of his birth he was a symbol before he was a person, an image to be projected and consumed and argued over, and the gap between the real man and the public image was never his to close. The legend of the Cold Prince was, in the end, a creation of the machine as much as of the man, a true observation about his reserve, twisted by a medium that punishes reserve into a false conclusion about his heart. Charles spent his whole life being seen, and almost none of it being understood, and the difference between those two things is the difference between the legend and the truth. That is perhaps the final and most human thing to say about him. He was a man who was looked at more than any person who has ever lived, and known, really known, by almost no one outside the small circle behind the palace doors. The cameras captured everything and understood nothing. They recorded the still face and the awkward pause and the stiff formality, and they told the world it was looking at a cold man, when it was in fact looking at a guarded one, which is not the same thing at all, and never was. The tragedy was not that Charles was cold. The tragedy was that he was so thoroughly and so permanently misread by a machine that could see him perfectly and understand him not at all. For the whole of a life he never got to live in private. The Mirror showed the nation a cold prince for 40 years. The truth, as the record finally reveals it, was always something the Mirror could not capture. A difficult, dutiful, deeply feeling man, doing his flawed and human best, behind doors the cameras were never allowed to open, in a life that belonged, from his first breath to his last, to everyone except himself. But the immediate fury of those days fell hardest not on Charles but on the Queen, who, following royal protocol and her own instinct for privacy and grief, remained at Balmoral with her grandsons, and declined at first to make the public displays the nation demanded. The press turned on the monarchy itself, and in that crisis something unexpected happened, something that complicates the picture of Charles as the unfeeling villain. Behind the scenes, by multiple later accounts, it was Charles who pushed hardest for the royal family to respond to the public mood, who understood the danger the institution was in, and who insisted on flying to Paris himself to bring Diana's body home. Whatever his failures as a husband, in the days after her death he was, by these accounts, the one who grasped what needed to be done, both for the monarchy and for his two grieving boys, then aged 15 and 12, because that is the part of the story most easily forgotten in the rush to assign blame. Charles was, suddenly, a single father to two sons who had lost their mother in the most public and traumatic way imaginable. Whatever else can be said about him, the record of the years that followed is the record of a father who was present for his children's grief, who walked behind his former wife's coffin alongside his sons in front of the watching world, and who tried, in his guarded and imperfect way, to shield William and Harry from the worst of what was happening around them. The man the public had decided was cold was, in that moment, doing the warmest and hardest thing a parent can do, which is to hold himself together for the sake of children who are falling apart. The death of Diana sank Charles's public standing to a depth from which many believed it would never recover. There was serious, sustained speculation that he would never be king at all, that the crown would pass over him entirely and go directly to William, who carried his mother's glamour and none of his father's baggage. The idea was discussed openly. For a man who had waited his entire life for the throne, who had built a whole identity around the patient endurance of the heir, to be told by a significant portion of the country that he... Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.